on a quiet hill above the town of Weimar, where tourists once came to celebrate Goethe and German poetry. The wind still moves through the trees exactly as it did in 1937. It sounds peaceful. It sounds ordinary. But beneath that wind, beneath the soil, beneath the foundations of old barracks and watchtowers, lies one of the most revealing and most disturbing stories of the Nazi system. This was Buchenwald, not built at first as an extermination factory like Auschwitz, not hidden in occupied Poland, but placed deliberately inside Germany itself. A camp that evolved, a camp that adapted, a camp that became a laboratory of cruelty, forced labor, medical experimentation, secret executions, resistance, and finally, uprising. More than 250,000 prisoners passed through its gates. Tens of thousands never left. And here's what makes Buchenwald different. This wasn't just a place of death. It was a system in motion. It changed as the war changed. It reflected the priorities of the regime at every stage: political repression, racial persecution, economic exploitation, total war collapse. Inside its barbed wire, you can see the entire arc of Nazi Germany unfold in miniature. The early arrests of political enemies, the mass imprisonment of Jews after Kristallnacht, the arrival of Soviet POWs, the starvation years, the medical experiments, the secret executions, the children hidden from the SS, and in the final days of the war, something almost unthinkable, a camp that helped liberate itself. If you stay with me, we're going to walk through this story from the very beginning, from the moment the first prisoners were forced to clear the forest on that hill, all the way to the day American troops arrived and the world saw what had been happening there. We're not just going to list events. We're going to understand how this place functioned, how ordinary men became administrators of horror, how prisoners survived inside a machine designed to break them, and why Buchenwald still matters today. Because if you truly want to understand how the Nazi system worked, not just how it killed, but how it controlled, exploited, and endured, you have to understand Buchenwald. And once you see how it all fits together, you won't be able to unsee it. Before the watchtowers, before the barbed wire, before the crematorium, smoke ever rose above the trees, there was just a forest. In the summer of 1937, the hill called Ettersberg stood quiet above the elegant town of Weimar. Pine and beech trees stretched toward the sky. Birds cut through the air. The wind moved gently across the soil. Just a few miles away, tourists still visited the homes of Goethe and Schiller, symbols of German culture and enlightenment. It felt like a place untouched by violence. But that illusion was about to end. One morning, trucks began climbing the narrow road into the woods. The engines growled against the silence. Armed SS guards rode in the back, their boots pressed against the metal floor, rifles resting across their knees. Inside the trucks, packed tightly together, were men who had been arrested not for crimes, but for beliefs. Communists, social democrats, trade union organizers, Jehovah's Witnesses, men who had dared to oppose, question, or simply not align themselves with Adolf Hitler's regime. The forest would not remain a forest for long. The decision to build a new concentration camp in central Germany did not come suddenly. By 1937, the Nazi regime had already established camps like Dachau and Sachsenhausen. But those early camps were becoming overcrowded. The SS, under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, was expanding its power rapidly. Himmler did not see concentration camps as temporary tools of intimidation. He saw them as permanent instruments of state control, laboratories where political enemies could be isolated, broken, and exploited. And so a new site was chosen, not hidden in occupied territory, not tucked away beyond Germany's borders, but placed deliberately inside the Reich itself, near Weimar, the cultural heart of Germany. There was something calculated in that choice. Weimar represented German literature, philosophy, refinement. To build a camp nearby was not an accident. It was a statement. The regime did not fear proximity to culture. It intended to redefine it. Construction began in July of 1937, but the SS did not hire civilian contractors to clear the land. They brought prisoners. The first men forced up the hill were taken from Sachsenhausen. When they stepped down from the trucks, the scent of pine needles mixed with exhaust fumes. The air was thick with late summer humidity. Guards shouted orders. Boots struck earth. The prisoners were handed shovels, axes, crude tools, and they began cutting the forest down. They slept in makeshift tents at first. No proper barracks. No infrastructure. Just mud beneath their boots and the constant bark of commands in their ears. The workday stretched endlessly. Trees crashed to the ground. Roots were torn from soil. The land was leveled by exhausted hands. The sound never stopped. Axes splitting wood, saws grinding through trunks, guards yelling, dogs barking, men coughing from dust and fatigue. This was how Buchenwald was born, not through blueprints alone, but through forced labor, through suffering embedded into its foundation. By August, wooden barracks began to rise from the cleared earth. Guard towers followed. Barbed wire was strung around the perimeter like a tightening noose. The camp layout reflected cold efficiency. Administrative buildings near the entrance, prisoner barracks in rows, a roll call square at the center. A space designed for control and humiliation. Above the main gate, the SS installed iron letters that read, Jedem das Sein. To each his own. The phrase had ancient origins in Roman law. In another context, it spoke of justice, of giving each person what they deserved. But here, the words were twisted into something cruel. The letters faced inward, visible only to the prisoners. Every morning and every night, they would pass beneath that inscription. It was a reminder that the regime believed their suffering was justified. The first official commandant of Buchenwald was Karl Otto Koch, an SS officer already known for brutality. He was ambitious, ruthless, and eager to prove himself within the expanding SS hierarchy. Under his command, discipline was enforced not merely through regulation, but through terror. The early prisoner population consisted primarily of political detainees. Many had been arrested during waves of repression that followed Hitler's consolidation of power. Trade union leaders who had organized strikes. Social democrats who refused to dissolve their networks. Communists who had resisted the Nazi Party's rise. They were labeled enemies of the state, protective custody cases, though there was nothing protective about their confinement. When they arrived, their hair was shaved. Their clothes were replaced with striped uniforms. Colored triangles were sewn onto their chests to identify their classification. Red triangles marked political prisoners. Green marked so-called criminals. Purple for Jehovah's Witnesses. Each color carried consequences within the camp hierarchy. Roll calls began before dawn. The prisoners stood in formation for hours, regardless of weather. Rain soaked their thin uniforms. Wind cut through fabric. In winter, frost clung to eyelashes and numbed fingers. If a man collapsed, he was beaten back to his feet or dragged away. The SS guards were not improvising cruelty. They were refining it. Himmler envisioned the camps as places where discipline would be absolute. He reorganized the concentration camp system in 1934, placing it firmly under SS control. By the time Buchenwald opened, the camps were no longer chaotic detention centers. They were structured institutions governed by rules, hierarchy, and economic ambition. Because Buchenwald was not only a prison, it was an investment. The SS established workshops inside the camp. Prisoners were forced to build furniture, repair equipment, and later manufacture goods for the German state. What began as punishment was evolving into exploitation. The regime recognized that captive labor could serve the economy. But in 1937, the primary goal was still political repression. Men who had once debated policy in union halls now dug drainage ditches under guard towers. Former city council members hauled stones across muddy ground. Intellectuals swung axes against tree trunks until their palms blistered and split. And there was humiliation woven into everything. Prisoners were forced to sing while marching to work. They were punished for speaking out of turn. They were beaten for perceived slights. The smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, damp wood, and latrines hung constantly in the air. Disease spread easily in crowded barracks. Food was thin soup and dark bread. barely enough to sustain heavy labor. Yet in those early months, Buchenwald was not yet a death camp in the sense the world would later understand. It was a tool of intimidation. The message was clear: oppose the regime, and you will disappear into places like this. But something was already shifting. In November of 1938, Germany erupted in orchestrated violence against Jewish communities. Kristallnacht. Synagogues burned. Shop windows shattered. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to camps, including Buchenwald. The camp population surged. The atmosphere changed. Political prisoners who had been there since the beginning suddenly found themselves alongside Jewish detainees dragged from their homes overnight. Some were businessmen. Some were teachers. Many had never engaged in political activism at all. Their crime was identity. The barracks grew more crowded. Tension thickened. The SS grew more confident. And through it all, the sign above the gate remained, Jedem das Sein. To each his own. It was more than mockery. It was ideology cast in iron. Himmler visited camps like Buchenwald to inspect progress. He believed these institutions would shape a new Germany. They would cleanse it of dissent. They would mold prisoners through discipline and labor. They would serve as instruments of racial policy. And the SS men stationed there understood that their careers could rise with the camp's expansion. Karl Otto Koch encouraged brutality. Prisoners were flogged publicly. Some were forced to carry heavy stones across the roll call square for hours. The camp infirmary was no sanctuary. It often functioned as a place where the weak were selected for punishment rather than care. Even in these early years, corruption flourished. Koch and his wife Ilse exploited the camp's resources for personal gain. Luxury items confiscated from prisoners found their way into private quarters. The contrast between prisoner starvation and SS indulgence was stark. The smell of roasted meat drifting from officers' housing, while men in striped uniforms scraped mold from bread. By the end of 1938, Buchenwald had grown into one of the largest concentration camps within Germany. Thousands were confined behind its wire. The forest that once stood tall was gone, replaced by barracks, guard towers, and gravel pathways worn smooth by forced marches. Yet outside the perimeter, life in Weimar continued. Cafes remained open. Theaters hosted performances. The proximity was unsettling. On clear days, townspeople could see the watchtowers in the distance. Smoke from camp chimneys sometimes drifted over rooftops. The separation between culture and cruelty was measured in miles, not continents. Inside the camp, something else was taking root. Political prisoners, especially communists, began organizing quietly. They memorized names. They kept mental records of abuse. They established small networks of solidarity within barracks. In whispers after lights out, they discussed survival strategies. Because already, it was clear that Buchenwald was not temporary. The regime was not softening. It was hardening. By 1939, Europe stood on the brink of war. And as Germany prepared for expansion beyond its borders, the role of camps like Buchenwald would evolve again. Political repression would merge with racial policy. Forced labor would scale up to meet wartime demand. The prisoner population would diversify: Poles, Soviets, resistance fighters from across Europe. But in those first 2 years, the blueprint was drawn. A forest cleared by prisoners. A gate marked with twisted justice. A system run by the SS with Himmler's blessing. And a population of men who had once believed Germany's descent into dictatorship might be temporary, now staring at barbed wire under gray skies, realizing it was not. The hill above Weimar no longer whispered with wind alone. It carried the echo of boots, the snap of orders, the dull thud of blows. Buchenwald was no longer an idea. It was a functioning machine. And as the world moved closer to total war, that machine was about to grow, faster, harsher, and far more deadly than anyone standing in that roll call square could yet imagine. The trees were gone now. Where birds once nested, floodlights stood. Where deer once moved silently through the undergrowth, search beams cut through the dark like blades. And below those lights, in neat geometric rows, stood the barracks of Buchenwald. Wood and wire arranged with mathematical precision, as if cruelty itself had been engineered. From the watchtower, the view was almost beautiful. Beyond the perimeter fence, the hills rolled gently toward Weimar. Church spires rose above rooftops. In the distance, smoke from domestic chimneys curled into the air in soft gray ribbons. It was a Germany that still imagined itself civilized, cultured, refined. Yet only a few kilometers away, men stood in formation on frozen gravel, their breath turning white in the cold, waiting for the count to end. The location had never been accidental. Ettersberg Hill was not chosen simply for its elevation or isolation. It sat near the symbolic heart of German intellectual history. Goethe had walked these woods. So had Schiller. For centuries, Weimar had represented the height of German literature, philosophy, and humanistic thought. The Nazis knew this. They embraced the symbolism, but not in the way one might expect. Buchenwald was not hidden. It was visible. That visibility sent a message. The new Germany did not reject culture. It claimed to redefine it. The regime would decide what was valuable, who belonged, and who would be cast out. In 1937 and 1938, as the camp expanded, its physical structure reflected the order the SS sought to impose. The main gate faced inward, so the words Jedem das Sein were visible only to those imprisoned. It was not propaganda for the outside world. It was psychological warfare for those inside. The letters were crafted in wrought iron, elegant in their design. They looked almost refined. But every morning, as prisoners shuffled through the gate toward forced labor, they were forced to read them. To each his own. The implication was clear. You are here because you deserve it. The architecture reinforced hierarchy. At the front of the camp stood the commandant's headquarters, administrative offices, and SS barracks. Clean lines, solid construction, windows intact, floors swept. Just beyond, separated by wire and guard posts, lay the prisoner compound, rows of wooden huts packed tightly together, their interiors crowded with triple-tier bunks. The camp was divided into blocks, each overseen by prisoner functionaries known as capos. The SS had learned from earlier camps that direct control over every detail was inefficient. Instead, they created a system where certain prisoners were granted limited authority in exchange for enforcing discipline among others. It was a calculated corruption. Some capos were political prisoners who attempted to use their positions to protect others when possible. Others embraced the power offered to them, becoming instruments of brutality. The system bred suspicion. Trust was dangerous. Alliances could shift overnight. Karl Otto Koch ruled over this structure with visible confidence. He appeared on inspections wearing polished boots and crisp uniform, often accompanied by his wife, Ilse Koch, whose presence inside the camp would later become infamous. Under his command, discipline was theatrical. Punishments were public. If a prisoner was accused of theft, sabotage, or insubordination, he might be tied to a whipping post in the center of the roll call square. Other prisoners were forced to watch as lashes fell, each strike echoing against the barracks walls. The smell of fear mingled with sweat and damp earth. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the crack of leather. These spectacles were not spontaneous. They were designed to reinforce the ideology of the camp. The SS did not merely want obedience. They wanted internalization, the acceptance that resistance was futile. The roll call square became a place of ritual humiliation. Prisoners stood for hours, sometimes in freezing temperatures, while guards counted and recounted. If numbers did not match, the process began again. Feet went numb, muscles cramped. Hunger gnawed constantly at the stomach. Food rations were minimal. Thin soup made from watery vegetables, sometimes flavored with scraps of meat, accompanied by a small piece of bread. The taste was bland, metallic even. Men learned to eat slowly, to stretch each bite. Hunger became a permanent sensation, a low ache that never disappeared. Yet in those early years, the camp population still consisted primarily of German prisoners. Political opponents remained the largest group. Many had been activists during the Weimar Republic. Some had participated in street clashes during the early 1930s when Nazi and communist factions battled openly. Others had simply refused to align with the new order. Their presence in Buchenwald represented the final consolidation of Nazi control. By 1938, organized political resistance inside Germany had largely been crushed. The camps served as both punishment and warning. Word of their existence spread quietly. Families received sparse information. Letters from prisoners were censored, limited to neutral phrases. Suffering could not be described openly. And yet rumors traveled. People in Weimar knew something was happening on the hill. They saw the trucks. They heard occasional gunshots carried by wind. Some chose not to ask questions. Others convinced themselves it was necessary, that the state must defend itself against enemies. Inside Buchenwald, daily life hardened into routine. Wait before dawn. Stand for roll call. March to labor sites. Work until exhaustion. Return. Roll call again. Sleep in overcrowded bunks. Bodies pressed close. The air thick with breath and the smell of unwashed clothing. Illness spread easily. Tuberculosis, dysentery, infections from untreated wounds. The infirmary offered limited care. Doctors among the prisoners tried to help when they could, but supplies were scarce. Medical treatment was rationed like food. And always, above it all, the SS ideology loomed. Heinrich Himmler envisioned the concentration camp system as part of a broader racial and political restructuring of Europe. In his mind, camps like Buchenwald were not temporary aberrations. They were foundations. He believed that through discipline, forced labor, and selective punishment, society could be purified. This belief filtered down through the ranks. Guards were trained to see prisoners not as individuals, but as categories. Political enemies, criminals, asocials. The language stripped away complexity. Once reduced to labels, mistreatment became easier to justify. By late 1938, after the events of Kristallnacht, Jewish prisoners filled additional barracks. Their arrival intensified the atmosphere. Many had been arrested abruptly, dragged from homes or businesses. They arrived disoriented, some still wearing civilian clothes beneath issued uniforms. For weeks, thousands of Jewish detainees were held at Buchenwald before being released on the condition that they leave Germany. It was extortion disguised as policy. Families were forced to secure visas, liquidate property, and prove intent to emigrate. The camp thus became a tool of coercion, a mechanism to accelerate the removal of Jews from German society. But as the months passed, it became clear that emigration would not remain the regime's primary solution. The physical infrastructure of Buchenwald continued to expand. Additional barracks were built. Workshops increased. Administrative offices grew more sophisticated. The camp began to resemble a small, self-contained city, one designed entirely around control. Electric fences hummed faintly at night. Their low buzz blended with the wind. Prisoners learned quickly that contact meant death. The watchtowers were manned constantly. Guards scanned the perimeter with binoculars. Dogs paced restlessly at their sides. The sense of being observed never faded. Even inside barracks, whispers were cautious. Yet beneath the surface, quiet forms of resistance emerged. Political prisoners, particularly communists who had prior experience organizing clandestinely, formed networks. They memorized the camp's structure. They tracked which guards were more predictable. They shared scraps of information, news from outside, rumors of international tension, fragments of hope. They also learned how to survive within the hierarchy. Some sought positions as block elders or clerks, not for privilege, but for access to lists, assignments, the ability to subtly alter work details that might spare a weaker prisoner from the most brutal tasks. It was a dangerous balancing act. Too much visibility invited suspicion. Too little influence meant helplessness. Meanwhile, the broader world moved toward catastrophe. In September of 1939, Germany invaded Poland. War had begun. Inside Buchenwald, the announcement did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with uncertainty. Political prisoners understood what war meant for a regime already willing to imprison dissenters without trial. The system would not shrink. It would grow. And with war came new categories of prisoners. Polish detainees began arriving. Some were captured resistance members. Others were intellectuals or community leaders targeted during occupation. The language barrier created additional isolation. Orders were barked in German. Misunderstandings were punished. The camp population became more diverse and more crowded. The purpose of Buchenwald began to shift subtly. No longer just a site for suppressing internal opposition, it became part of a larger wartime network. Forced labor demands increased. German industry, preparing for prolonged conflict, required workers. The SS recognized opportunity. Prisoners could be rented to companies. Their labor extracted at minimal cost. Exhaustion and death were secondary considerations. Replacement would always be available. The transformation was not yet complete, but it had begun. On certain nights, when the sky was clear, prisoners could see distant lights from Weimar flickering softly. Music sometimes drifted faintly on the wind, perhaps from a gathering, a celebration. The contrast was surreal. A world of art and conversation just beyond the barbed wire. And yet the camp did not hide itself. Smoke from chimneys rose steadily. Trucks moved along the road. The presence of Buchenwald became part of the landscape. Some townspeople visited the nearby woods unaware of the scale of what stood behind fences. Others suspected more than they admitted. The regime relied on a mixture of ignorance, fear, and ideological alignment. Inside the camp, the sense of permanence deepened. The prisoners who had arrived in 1937 had once believed their detention might be temporary, a harsh warning before release. By 1939, many understood that Buchenwald was not a passing storm. It was an institution designed to endure. The gravel beneath their boots was packed hard from countless roll calls. The barracks walls bore scratches and marks, small attempts to measure time. Seasons changed. Snow fell and melted. New prisoners arrived. Some disappeared. The forest had been replaced by order and wire. But beyond the physical transformation, something more profound had occurred. Buchenwald had become normalized. It functioned within the Reich not as a secret anomaly, but as an accepted component of governance. The SS managed it. The economy benefited from it. The ideology justified it. And as war expanded across Europe, the hill above Weimar would see an influx unlike anything in its first years. Because the next wave of prisoners would not come only from within Germany's borders. They would come from conquered territories, from battlefields, from resistance movements crushed under occupation. And with them would come new policies, harsher, more systematic, more lethal. The camp that began as a tool against political dissent was about to become something far larger. The floodlights already burned through the night. Soon, they would illuminate far darker chapters. The morning whistle shrieks before the sun rises, tearing through the barracks like a blade. Men jolt awake in the darkness, their bodies already aching from the day before. The air is thick, damp wood, stale breath, the sour smell of sweat soaked into straw mattresses. Someone coughs. Someone groans. Boots hit the floor. There is no time to stretch, no time to think. Outside, the floodlights are still on, humming faintly in the cold air. Another day in Buchenwald has begun. By the time the prisoners stumble into formation, frost clings to the gravel of the roll call square. Their striped uniforms are thin, stiff from sweat that never fully dried. Some men wrap rags around their hands to keep circulation moving. Others simply stare forward, conserving energy. The guards stand elevated, rifles slung, leather belts creaking as they shift their weight. Dogs strain against leashes, their breath steaming. The count begins. Numbers are barked, repeated, corrected. If a man is missing, the entire block waits. If the count does not align with the records, it starts again. Minutes stretch into hours. The sky lightens slowly over the Ettersberg Hill, pale gray replacing black. Hunger presses in, sharp and constant. No one speaks unless ordered to. Silence becomes survival. This is not chaos. It is structure. By 1939 and into 1940, Buchenwald has settled into a rigid system, a hierarchy that governs every movement, every ration, every punishment. The early months of construction are over. The camp is now fully operational, and its internal order is as deliberate as its barbed wire perimeter. At the top stand the SS officers. Beneath them, layers of administrative staff. And within the prisoner population, a carefully engineered structure designed to divide and control. Each prisoner wears a colored triangle sewn onto his chest. Red for political prisoners, communists, social democrats, resistance sympathizers. Green for those labeled criminals. Black for so-called socials. Purple for Jehovah's Witnesses. Pink for homosexual men. Yellow stars mark Jewish prisoners. Combinations indicate overlapping categories. These symbols are more than identification. They determine treatment, labor assignments, even survival chances. The red triangles, the political prisoners, form the largest early group. Many of them have experience organizing under pressure. They understand discipline. They recognize patterns in authority. Some begin to navigate the system strategically. The green triangles, prisoners convicted of crimes under German law, are often favored by the SS for internal positions. The regime believes they will be more ruthless in enforcing order. And often they are. The camp relies on prisoner functionaries, block elders, capos, clerks. These men receive marginally better rations, sometimes private sleeping space. In exchange, they oversee work details, maintain discipline, and report infractions. It is a system built on moral corrosion. Power is distributed downward, but responsibility for brutality is shared. Not all who hold these positions embrace cruelty. Some attempt to shield others, to assign lighter labor, when possible, to hide the sick during inspections. But the risk is constant. If an SS officer suspects favoritism or weakness, punishment is swift. Labor details assemble after roll call. The sound of boots marching across gravel becomes routine. Groups file through the gate under the iron words, Jedem das Sein, and disperse across assigned sites. Some work in the quarry, breaking stone under open sky. Others construct additional barracks, extend fencing, dig drainage systems. Workshops hum with activity, carpentry, metal repair, tailoring. The work is relentless. Hands blister and split. Shoulders burn. The weight of stones presses into the spine. Dust coats the tongue. Guards watch for any sign of slowing. A moment's hesitation can draw a shout, a blow from a rifle, but a kick to the ribs. Food does not match labor demands. Midday brings a pause. Thin soup ladled into metal bowls, often little more than hot water flavored with cabbage leaves. Bread rations are small, dense, slightly sour. Men learn to guard every crumb. Some hide fragments beneath mattresses. Theft can mean beating or worse. Hunger sharpens instincts. It also erodes restraint. Arguments flare in barracks over food, over space, over whispered accusations. The system encourages mistrust. Informants exist. Some prisoners collaborate with the SS to secure favor. Others remain silent but observant. And yet, beneath the surface tension, something else grows, a quiet, disciplined effort among political prisoners to maintain solidarity. In corners of the barracks after lights out, hushed conversations continue. News from outside filters in through new arrivals. Rumors of war movements. Reports from occupied Poland. Fragments of truth mixed with speculation. The men listen closely. Information is currency. The infirmary, known as the Revier, becomes a paradoxical space. It offers minimal medical care, bandages, basic treatment, but also serves as a sorting mechanism. Those too weak to work may be marked. Being sent to the infirmary can mean rest. It can also mean vulnerability during inspections. Disease spreads quickly in overcrowded blocks. Lice infest clothing. Dysentery moves silently from bunk to bunk. The smell of illness lingers, sour, metallic. Some men fade gradually, their cheeks hollowing, eyes sinking deeper into their sockets. Death, in these years, is present but not yet industrialized. Bodies are removed quietly. Roll call numbers adjusted. The machinery of record-keeping ensures the system continues uninterrupted. Beyond the labor details inside the main camp, the SS begins to explore external work sites. Small satellite commands are formed, sending prisoners to nearby construction projects or industrial facilities. The model is expanding. War accelerates everything. After Germany invades Poland, then moves westward into France and the Low Countries, prisoners from across Europe begin arriving. Poles enter the camp, resistance members, intellectuals, clergy. Their red and yellow triangles add new layers to the internal hierarchy. Language barriers complicate daily life. Orders shouted in German must be interpreted through gesture and fear. Misunderstandings can lead to punishment. But slowly, networks form across national lines. The camp becomes a microcosm of occupied Europe. Germans, Poles, Austrians, Czechs, later French and Dutch prisoners. Each group carries its own story of arrest, interrogation, transport. Transport trains arrive with a grinding of metal wheels. Doors slide open. The smell of human confinement spills out. Sweat, waste, fear concentrated in sealed compartments. New arrivals stumble into daylight, blinking. They're lined up, registered, shaved, issued uniforms. The processing is efficient. Name, date of birth, category, number. Numbers replace names in daily use. Identity narrows to digits stitched on a fabric. The brutality remains structured. Whippings are recorded. Punishments are logged. The SS prides itself on order. Random cruelty exists, but it is embedded within policy. The camp commandant still presides with authority. Karl Otto Koch enforces discipline, but rumors of corruption begin circulating even within the SS. Confiscated valuables from prisoners are rumored to be siphoned off for personal use. Ilse Koch's presence in the officers' quarters becomes part of camp folklore. Whispered accounts of her cruelty, her fascination with domination. Inside the prisoner population, resentment toward capos intensifies. Some capos enforce work quotas mercilessly, knowing their own survival depends on maintaining output. Others attempt subtle resistance, assigning friends to indoor tasks during harsh weather, adjusting rosters to spare the sick. The line between victim and enforcer blurs. Roll call squares become stages of endurance. Winter of 1939 into 1940 is bitter. Snow blankets the hill. Wind cuts through gaps in barrack walls. Men wrap newspaper under uniforms to trap heat. Frostbite claims fingers and toes. The cold seeps into bones, making sleep nearly impossible. At night, the camp does not rest. Floodlights cast long shadows. Guard patrol. The electric fence hums faintly. Occasionally, a shot cracks through the darkness. A warning, or something more final. Some prisoners contemplate escape. Few attempt it. The terrain is exposed. The surrounding population is unlikely to offer help. Capture would mean torture or public execution. So survival becomes the primary objective. To survive, one must adapt. Prisoners learn how to stand in ways that conserve energy, how to distribute weight while carrying stones, how to trade small favors, a piece of bread for mending services, a place in line for access to information. Microeconomies form inside barracks. Hope fluctuates. Some believe war might eventually weaken the regime. Others fear it will only strengthen it. The uncertainty weighs heavily. Time stretches without clear endpoint. Yet even as routine solidifies, the ideological foundation of Buchenwald shifts subtly. The regime's racial policies intensify. Jewish prisoners, initially released after Kristallnacht under immigration pressure, are increasingly held longer. New directives suggest harsher treatment. The language used by guards grows more openly dehumanizing. The camp is no longer just about isolating political opponents. It is becoming part of a broader racial project. Meanwhile, forced labor demands increase. German industry, now fully mobilized for war, requires resources and manpower. The SS sees opportunity in scale. Prisoners can be deployed wherever needed: construction, agriculture, manufacturing. The concept of exploitation overtakes the original emphasis on re-education or intimidation. Buchenwald's administrative apparatus grows more complex. Files stack higher in offices. Reports are filed to Berlin. Statistics are compiled. Numbers of prisoners, deaths, work output. The camp becomes data-driven in its cruelty. And yet, amid this machinery, small acts of defiance continue. Political prisoners maintain clandestine records of abuses. They memorize names of the dead. They note dates of particularly brutal incidents. It is a quiet preservation of truth against a system designed to erase individuality. Some risk their positions as clerks to alter documents, to misclassify a prisoner in order to protect him. These actions are small, dangerous, and often invisible. The forest that once covered Ettersburg is now replaced entirely by infrastructure. Gravel roads cut through the compound. Storage sheds hold confiscated property. Workshops hum from dawn until dusk. Outside the wire, the war expands. France falls. The Luftwaffe bombs Britain. Europe trembles under occupation. And inside Buchenwald, the influx of foreign prisoners continues. The camp's population grows beyond its original capacity. Barracks built for fewer men now house far more. Bunks are shared in shifts. Privacy disappears entirely. The soundscape changes too. Different languages echo in corridors. French curses under breath. Polish prayers whispered at night. German commands overriding all. The early political prisoners, those who arrived when the forest was first cut down, look around and realize something profound. Buchenwald is no longer an isolated tool of domestic repression. It is becoming a node in a continental system. And systems evolve. By late 1940, the SS begins considering further expansion, additional subcamps, increased industrial partnerships. The boundaries of Buchenwald extend beyond its fences into surrounding regions. What began as a camp for Germany's internal enemies is transforming into a central hub of forced labor and multinational imprisonment. The routines remain brutal. The roll calls unending. The hunger constant. But beneath the surface, the scale is shifting. More prisoners arrive. More categories are created. More labor is demanded. The machinery is gaining momentum. And soon, new groups will be introduced into this hierarchy. Prisoners who are not merely political opponents or occupied civilians, but captured soldiers from a war that is about to widen eastward. When Germany turns its forces toward the Soviet Union, Buchenwald will receive a new kind of prisoner. And the system, already harsh, will harden further. The morning whistle will still shriek. The floodlights will still burn. But the next phase will test the limits of what this structure, this carefully ordered cruelty, is capable of becoming. The glass was still on the streets when they came for them. In November of 1938, flames had climbed into the night sky across Germany. Synagogues burned. Storefronts were smashed open. Torah scrolls were dragged into the street and set alight. The crack of breaking glass echoed through cities and towns, sharp and relentless. It looked like chaos, but it was not chaos. It was coordinated. And in the days that followed, thousands of Jewish men were arrested. Some were pulled from their beds before dawn. Others were taken from offices, from shops, still smelling of smoke and ash. They were told it was protective custody. They were told it would be temporary. They were herded onto trucks, onto trains, into holding cells. Many had no idea where they were going. When the transports arrived at Buchenwald, the gates were already waiting. The air on the Ettersburg Hill was cold and wet. Guards shouted orders as the new arrivals stumbled off the trucks. Some still wore suits beneath overcoats, ties loosened but intact. Others had been beaten before departure, faces swollen, glasses shattered. Their hair was cut roughly. Their belongings confiscated, rings removed, wallets emptied. The iron letters above the gate faced inward, as always. Jedem das Sein. To each his own. For the Jewish prisoners arriving after Kristallnacht, the message felt particularly cruel. They were processed quickly. Names recorded. Heads shaved. Civilian clothes stripped away. Striped uniforms issued, often in incorrect sizes. Yellow triangles stitched into place. Some are marked with double triangles forming a Star of David, identifying them as Jewish political prisoners if they had prior affiliations. The barracks were already crowded. Now they overflowed. Political prisoners who had been there since the camp's early days watched the influx with a mixture of sympathy and apprehension. They understood that something significant was happening. The regime had shifted from marginalizing Jews socially and economically to mass incarceration. For weeks, Buchenwald absorbed thousands of Jewish detainees. Conditions tightened immediately. Food rations did not increase with population. Soup thinned further. Bread portions shrank. Men who had once shared space with limited hostility now found themselves pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers from different cities, different professions, different levels of shock. The smell inside the barracks changed. New clothing carried traces of smoke from burned synagogues, of perfume from homes abruptly abandoned, of city air. It mixed with the existing scent of damp wood and sweat. The Jewish prisoners were not seasoned political activists accustomed to clandestine life. Many were businessmen, lawyers, teachers, rabbis. They had believed, even as anti-Jewish laws multiplied, that Germany would not descend into this level of violence. Standing on a roll call square in the early morning frost, some still tried to understand how it had happened so quickly. Roll calls became longer. The SS used the new arrivals to demonstrate power. Public beatings increased. Some Jewish prisoners were singled out for humiliation, forced to scrub latrines with bare hands, made to run in circles until collapse. Guards hurled insults that echoed across the square. But the regime's intent in these early months was not yet systematic extermination. It was coercion. Families outside the camp received word: secure immigration papers, pay fines, prove intent to leave the Reich. If arrangements could be made, some prisoners would be released on condition they depart Germany permanently. Buchenwald thus became a pressure chamber. Inside, Jewish detainees endured beatings and starvation. Outside, relatives scrambled for visas, sold property at reduced prices, navigated bureaucratic obstacles designed to extract wealth before departure. Time was measured not only in roll calls, but in hope for paperwork. For many, release came after weeks or months, but only if they could demonstrate concrete plans to emigrate. Those unable to do so remained. The camp population fluctuated as releases occurred. Yet the atmosphere had changed irreversibly. Buchenwald was no longer simply a camp for political opponents. It was a racial prison, and with that shift came deeper ideological reinforcement from the SS. Guards spoke more openly of racial hierarchy. Propaganda language seeped into daily orders. Jewish prisoners were assigned to particularly degrading labor details. Some were forced to clear human waste or carry heavy stones under intensified scrutiny. In the infirmary, Jewish detainees often received delayed treatment. Small infections worsened. Weight dropped rapidly under insufficient rations. The political prisoners observed carefully. Some extended quiet assistance, sharing bread, offering guidance on surviving roll call, advising newcomers on which guards to avoid. Others, under pressure or fear, kept distance. Solidarity was not automatic. It had to be built. Outside the barbed wire, German society adjusted with alarming speed. Kristallnacht had signaled a new phase of state-sponsored violence. Many citizens witnessed the burning synagogues, the arrests, the smashed windows. Some protested quietly. Many remained silent. Some approved. Buchenwald's role in this escalation was unmistakable. The camp's infrastructure strained under numbers. Additional barracks were erected hurriedly. Sanitation deteriorated. Latrines overflowed. Disease risk increased. The SS responded not by easing conditions, but by tightening discipline. Punishment blocks filled. One such space, the bunker, became notorious. Prisoners accused of infractions were confined in dark cells with minimal food. The smell inside was suffocating. Stale air, human waste, damp stone. Days passed without clear sense of time. The psychological impact deepened. 4 Jewish prisoners who had lived relatively integrated lives before 1933. The abrupt transition to striped uniforms and barbed wire felt surreal. The humiliation was total. They were no longer neighbors or colleagues. They were numbers. And yet, amid brutality, acts of humanity flickered. In one barracks, a former rabbi whispered prayers after lights out. In another, a lawyer shared stories of his children to keep despair at bay. Political prisoners described earlier years of resistance, reminding newcomers that regimes could change, that history was not fixed. Winter descended over the Ettersberg. Snow fell heavily. It muffled the sounds of the camp for brief moments, boots crunching instead of scraping, shouts echoing more softly. But the cold introduced new dangers. Frostbite spread among those lacking adequate footwear. Fingers cracked and bled. Jewish prisoners, weakened by shock and insufficient food, were particularly vulnerable. Yet releases continued sporadically. By early 1939, thousands of Jewish men who had arrived after Kristallnacht were freed, but only after agreeing to leave Germany. Their release did not signal mercy. It was strategic. The regime sought to accelerate Jewish immigration while stripping families of assets. But this window was narrowing. International barriers to immigration tightened. Countries limited visa quotas. As war approached, borders grew less permeable. Inside Buchenwald, those who remained sensed a shift. The camp's purpose was evolving again. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Jewish communities in occupied territories faced immediate persecution. Ghettos were established. Deportations began. Buchenwald prepared to receive new categories of prisoners from beyond the Reich's pre-war borders. The Jewish detainees who had survived the Kristallnacht wave now found themselves part of a broader, expanding machinery. The SS adjusted internal procedures. Registration categories became more complex. Transport logistics improved. The camp's administrative staff recorded arrivals and departures with increasing efficiency. And the rhetoric hardened. Guards spoke less of immigration and more of containment. The tone shifted from coercive expulsion to systematic segregation. Within the barracks, relationships between prisoner groups evolved. Some political prisoners recognized that the regime's racial policies represented a threat beyond politics, a restructuring of society itself. Conversations grew more serious. Resistance networks quietly expanded their awareness of Jewish suffering. The hierarchy of colored triangles remained, but boundaries blurred under shared hardship. At roll call, rows of red and yellow triangles stood together beneath gray skies. Punishments continued to be public. One afternoon, a Jewish prisoner accused of failing to remove his cap quickly enough was dragged to the whipping post. Other inmates were forced to watch. The guard counted each lash aloud. The sound of leather striking skin cut through the winter air. Some prisoners looked away. Others stared, memorizing. The message was clear. Humiliation would be visible. Buchenwald was not hidden deep in remote wilderness. It stood near Weimar, a town of culture and history. On certain clear days, the towers could be glimpsed from distant hills. The contrast between Goethe's legacy and the camp's brutality sharpened the irony. The Nazis did not seek contradiction. They believed culture could coexist with exclusion, that a purified Germany required the removal of those deemed alien. As 1940 approached, the temporary nature of Jewish imprisonment after Kristallnacht gave way to longer detentions. Releases became less frequent. The logic of expulsion was giving way to something more permanent. The political prisoners who had once been the camp's primary population now witnessed the transformation firsthand. They understood that Buchenwald was no longer just suppressing dissent. It was absorbing the consequences of a radical racial agenda. And beyond Germany's borders, that agenda was expanding. In occupied Poland, ghettos were sealing entire communities into confined districts. Reports trickled into the camp through new arrivals. Stories of forced relocations, starvation policies, shootings. The men standing beneath the iron gate sensed the horizon darkening. Buchenwald's early years have been defined by political repression and controlled intimidation. The Kristallnacht wave marked a decisive escalation, from targeting opposition to targeting identity. And this was only the beginning. The camp that had once been a warning to political enemies was becoming part of a continental system aimed at reshaping Europe along racial lines. The floodlights still hummed at night. The electric fence still buzzed softly. Roll call still began before dawn. But something fundamental had shifted. The question was no longer whether Jewish prisoners would be released to emigrate. It was what would happen when there was nowhere left to go. And as war spread eastward, that question would find its answer in ways even the hardened prisoners of Buchenwald could scarcely imagine. The news arrives not with celebration inside the barbed wire, but with a change in tone. September 1939. Germany has invaded Poland. War, which had been hovering at the edges of conversation, is now official. The guards stand straighter at roll call. Orders are barked with sharper rhythm. The air itself feels tighter, as if the camp understands before anyone says it aloud. Everything is about to change. On the Ettersberg Hill, the routine continues. The whistle before dawn, the lines on the gravel, the thin soup steaming in dented metal bowls. But beneath the repetition, the machinery is shifting. Buchenwald was built to silence Germany's political enemies. Now it will serve a war. The first transports from occupied Poland arrive within weeks. The train doors slide open with a metallic scrape. Inside are men who have already experienced violence. Resistance members, priests, teachers, former soldiers. Some still wear civilian coats over thin shirts. Their faces are drawn, eyes hollow from travel. The smell of the transport, sweat, urine, fear, spills into the open air as they stumble onto the platform. They do not understand the shouted commands in German. They are pushed forward anyway. Registration becomes more efficient. Names are taken quickly, heads shaved without ceremony, clothing confiscated, numbers assigned. The process is no longer experimental. It is streamlined. Buchenwald's population grows. Barracks designed for fewer men now hold far more. Bunks are shared in shifts. Some sleep on bare boards when space runs out. At night, bodies press together for warmth. But the closeness brings its own discomfort. Coughing, restless movement, whispered prayers in unfamiliar languages. The hierarchy inside the camp strains under the new arrivals. Political prisoners who once formed the majority now find themselves part of a larger mosaic. Poles are assigned red triangles for political classification, sometimes combined with other markings. Communication is fragmented. Orders must be translated informally through gestures and repetition. Misunderstanding becomes dangerous. If a Polish prisoner fails to respond quickly enough to a shouted instruction, a rifle but answers in place of explanation. Punishments grow harsher. The guards, fueled by wartime propaganda, treat prisoners from occupied territories as inferior subjects. The rhythm of labor intensifies. Germany's war machine requires materials, infrastructure, manpower. The SS leadership recognizes that concentration camps are not just instruments of terror. They are reservoirs of labor. Work details expand. Prisoners are sent to nearby construction sites beyond the main compound. Roads are widened. Storage facilities built. Workshops inside the camp increase output, tailoring uniforms, repairing equipment, producing small manufactured goods. The quarry becomes busier. The sound of stone cracking under hammer blows echoes across the hill. Dust clings to skin and throat. Men carry heavy loads up inclines slick with mud. A stumble can mean a fall, and a fall can mean a beating. Hunger sharpens. Rations do not increase with labor demands. The soup remains thin. Bread portions are calculated carefully. Some prisoners chew slowly, eyes closed, trying to stretch sensation into sustenance. Illness rises with exhaustion. The infirmary fills with men suffering from malnutrition, infected wounds, respiratory illness. The smell of antiseptic mixes with that of decay. Medical supplies are limited. Doctors among the prisoners do what they can, but the system does not prioritize recovery. A sick prisoner who cannot work becomes a burden. Death becomes more frequent. Bodies are removed quietly, wrapped, and taken away. The roll call count adjusts. The system absorbs loss without pause. And still, the war expands. In the spring of 1940, German forces push west. Denmark falls. Norway. Then the Netherlands, Belgium, France. Each victory fuels propaganda outside the camp. Images of triumph. Speeches broadcast over radios and cities. Inside Buchenwald, triumph translates into more transports. French prisoners begin to arrive. Resistance members, captured soldiers, civilians accused of sabotage. Their accents cut through the barracks at night. They bring stories of occupation, of bombed towns, of arrests conducted at dawn. The camp population becomes multinational. German political prisoners who once felt alone now find themselves among men from across Europe. The roll call square displays a spectrum of faces, languages, histories, all reduced to stripes and numbers. The SS administration adapts accordingly. Records expand. Nationality categories multiply. Clerks within the prisoner ranks work long hours updating lists. Efficiency is valued. Precision is demanded. And through it all, the ideological framework tightens. Guards speak openly of German destiny, of cleansing Europe, of eliminating threats. Wartime rhetoric filters into daily discipline. Prisoners from occupied territories are treated with particular severity. Collective punishment becomes more common. If one man is suspected of insubordination, his entire work detail may be forced to stand for hours after labor, muscles trembling under fatigue. Winter of 1940 descends with renewed cruelty. Snow blankets the camp. Wind slices through gaps in barrack walls. The electric fence hums faintly beneath ice. Men wrap rags around feet to stave off frostbite. The cold is not just uncomfortable, it is strategic. Weakness spreads faster in winter. Yet the machinery of expansion continues. The SS begins to envision Buchenwald not merely as a single camp, but as a hub. Satellite subcamps are planned near industrial sites where labor can be exploited more directly. Prisoners will be dispatched outward, their bodies integrated into factories and construction zones. The concept of forced labor shifts from supplementary to central. Economic offices of the SS coordinate with German companies. Agreements are made. Prisoners can be leased. Output quotas established. The camp becomes profitable. Inside the barracks, awareness grows among political prisoners that survival may increasingly depend on work assignments. Those able to secure indoor positions, clerical roles, workshops, have marginally better chances. Those sent to heavy outdoor labor face accelerated decline. Networks of quiet influence intensify. Experienced prisoners seek positions that allow them to assign tasks. They attempt to shield the weakest when possible. A swap here, a subtle adjustment there. These acts are small, often invisible, but meaningful. The SS tolerates prisoner functionaries because they enhance efficiency. But loyalty is monitored constantly. Suspicion hovers. In the commandant's quarters, administrative discussions focus on output, discipline, expansion. Buchenwald is no longer an experiment. It is an established component of the Reich's infrastructure. And then, in June of 1941, Germany turns east. Operation Barbarossa begins. The invasion of the Soviet Union opens a front unlike any before. The war becomes ideological to an unprecedented degree. It is framed as a struggle against Bolshevism, against perceived racial enemies. The consequences reach Buchenwald swiftly. Soviet prisoners of war begin to arrive. They are gone from capture, uniforms torn, faces burned by sun and wind. Many have marched long distances before transport. Their numbers are high. Their treatment is brutal from the outset. Unlike earlier groups, Soviet POWs are often denied even minimal recognition under international conventions. They are viewed through a lens of racial hatred and political contempt. Upon arrival, many are separated from other prisoners. Executions begin to occur with greater frequency. Behind certain buildings, shots echo. Rumors spread quickly through the barracks. Men whisper about a facility where prisoners are led one by one under the pretense of medical examination, only to be shot in the neck. The details are fragmentary at first, but fear sharpens perception. The camp is entering a new phase. Political repression, racial persecution, economic exploitation. These elements had already converged. Now systematic killing edges closer to routine. The Soviet prisoners suffer catastrophic mortality rates, starvation rations, exposure, summary execution. The SS views them as expendable. For the existing prisoner population, the arrival of Soviet POWs is a turning point. It signals that the war in the East is being conducted with fewer restraints, that ideological extermination is no longer abstract. The atmosphere in Buchenwald darkens. Roll calls remain rigid. Labor details expand further to meet wartime production. But an undercurrent of dread spreads. If Soviet soldiers can be treated as disposable, what limits remain? Inside the camp, clandestine resistance networks expand quietly in response. Political prisoners recognize that documentation is crucial. Names of the executed are memorized when possible. Dates whispered and retained. The intention is clear. If the regime falls, the record must survive. But the regime shows no sign of falling. German victories in the early months of the Eastern Campaign reinforce SS confidence. Guards swagger more openly. Brutality is performed without hesitation. The camp's physical footprint grows. Additional storage facilities, expanded workshops, preparations for more subcamps tied to armaments production. Prisoners march out each morning beneath the inward-facing inscription, Jedem das Sein, but its meaning has shifted yet again. It is no longer just mockery. It is justification. To each his own. To the political dissenter, imprisonment. To the Jew, humiliation and confinement. To the Soviet soldier, execution. The ideology has found its war. By late 1941, Buchenwald holds men from across Europe and beyond. The languages spoken at night multiply. Polish prayers mix with French curses. Russian whispers drift between bunks. The sense of shared fate deepens. Even those who once hoped for release through emigration understand that options are narrowing. Borders are sealed. War consumes continents. Hunger intensifies as supply chains strain under prolonged conflict. Bread rations shrink subtly. Soup grows thinner. The infirmary struggles to cope. Infections spread through overcrowded blocks. Lice infestations become endemic. Men scratch until skin breaks. Sleep becomes fragmented by discomfort and fear. And yet, production quotas increase. Factories in need of labor press for more prisoners. The SS responds by expanding transport capacity. Buchenwald, once a camp carved from forest to silence domestic opposition, has become an integral cog in a continental war machine. The hill above Weimar is no longer simply a site of repression. It is a staging ground for forced labor, a holding pen for conquered populations, a place where ideological hatred translates into systematic suffering. And the war is far from over. If anything, it is accelerating. The Eastern Front will grow bloodier. Casualties will mount. And as the Reich demands more resources, more labor, more obedience, Buchenwald will be pushed to expand further, physically, administratively, and morally. The whistle will still sound before dawn. The floodlights will still hum. But the next phase will draw the camp deeper into industrial exploitation, binding it directly to factories producing weapons of war. And with that integration will come new forms of brutality, new calculations of human worth measured not in ideology alone, but in output. The machinery is no longer merely punitive. It is becoming industrial. And once that transformation completes, the scale of suffering will grow beyond anything the early prisoners of 1937 could have imagined. The sound is different now. It is no longer just the crack of rifle butts or the bark of roll call commands. It is the metallic rhythm of machines, the grinding of gears, the steady hammering of production. Beneath the watchtowers of Buchenwald, industry has begun to hum. The war has entered its most demanding phase, and the Reich needs labor, endless, obedient, disposable labor. On the Ettersberg Hill, the SS understands that the camp is no longer merely a prison. It is a resource. By 1942, the transformation is undeniable. What began as a site of political repression has evolved into a central node of forced industrial labor. Prisoners are no longer just being punished. They are being extracted, their strength measured in output, their value calculated in units produced per day. Each morning, after the whistle cuts through the darkness, work details assemble not only for quarry and construction, but for factories. Trucks rumble through the gates. Columns of prisoners march out under guard, boots crunching over frost or mud, depending on the season. Some remain within the main compound, assigned to workshops that now operate with near-constant intensity. Others are transported to satellite camps attached directly to industrial plants. The smell of oil joins the scent of damp wood and sweat. Inside the camp's expanding workshops, prisoners bend over lathes and presses. Metal shavings scatter across concrete floors. Sparks flash briefly in dim light. Hands blister from repetitive motion. The noise is relentless, machinery pounding in a rhythm that drowns out thought. German companies enter into formal arrangements with the SS. Contracts are signed. Prisoners can be leased. The SS receives payment per worker per day. The arrangement is cold, transactional. The prisoner becomes a line item in an economic calculation. Among the companies tied to Buchenwald is the armaments industry. As Allied bombing intensifies over German cities, production facilities are moved or reinforced. Some are built underground, shielded from air raids. Buchenwald's proximity to central Germany makes it strategically useful. Subcamps multiply. Dozens of smaller camps branch outward from the main compound, each connected to a specific industrial need. Prisoners are dispatched to dig tunnels, construct aircraft parts, assemble weapons components. They live in makeshift barracks near factory sites, under equally brutal conditions. The camp system has become decentralized. Back at the main compound, the hierarchy adapts to the new priorities. Work assignment becomes the defining factor of survival. Indoor factory labor, though exhausting, may offer slight protection from winter's bite. Outdoor construction details, especially those involving heavy stone or earth moving, accelerate decline. A weak prisoner assigned to quarry duty may not last long. Clerks within the prisoner administration recognize this shift. They understand that a subtle change in work detail can mean life or death. Networks of influence grow more important. Political prisoners who have secured administrative roles attempt, when possible, to steer the frail away from the harshest labor. But there are limits. Production quotas are strict. If output falls short, punishment follows. Guards conduct inspections inside workshops. They pace between rows of bent backs, watching for slow hands or mistakes. A drop tool can trigger a blow. A misaligned part can provoke public humiliation. The soundscape of Buchenwald now includes factory whistles layered over the camp whistle. Shifts are extended. Night work becomes common in certain subcamps. Sleep shrinks. In overcrowded barracks, men collapse onto bunks after hours of labor, muscles trembling. The air is thick with exhaustion. Some fall asleep mid-sentence. Others lie awake, hearts pounding, calculating how to endure another day. Food remains insufficient. Caloric intake does not match the demands of industrial labor. Soup is thin, bread rationed precisely. Some prisoners resort to scraping grease from workshop machinery to add to meals. Others trade small favors for extra crusts. Malnutrition deepens. Bodies thin visibly. Cheeks hollow. Ribs emerge beneath striped cloth. Yet the machinery does not slow. The SS develops an internal logic to justify this exploitation. They frame it as productive use of enemy elements, as contribution to the war effort, as efficiency. In truth, it is a system of consumption. Prisoners are consumed in the process of producing weapons, aircraft components, munitions. When they weaken beyond usefulness, they are replaced. Transport trains continue to arrive. New groups of prisoners are funneled into the labor system. French resistance fighters, Dutch detainees, Belgians, Poles. Later, Italians after their government collapses. Each group expands the labor pool. Language barriers complicate factory coordination, but brutality simplifies instruction. Gestures, shouts, demonstrations enforced with violence. The subcamp network becomes vast. One of the most significant expansions is tied to underground armaments production. Allied bombing has crippled many above-ground facilities. In response, the Reich shifts manufacturing into tunnels carved into hillsides and mountains. Prisoners from Buchenwald are sent to dig these tunnels. They work in darkness thick with dust. The air is heavy, difficult to breathe. Explosions from controlled blasts reverberate through rock. Debris falls unpredictably. Collapses occur. Men choke on fine particles. Coughing fits echo in the confined spaces. Protective equipment is minimal or non-existent. Shifts stretch long, often beyond endurance. The smell underground is suffocating. Damp stone, sweat, oil, explosives. Above ground, guards pace the entrances. The underground sites become synonymous with slow death. Back in the main camp, administrative offices track output meticulously. Reports are sent to Berlin detailing numbers of workers, hours logged, components produced. Buchenwald has become an economic asset. This transformation alters the relationship between the SS and industry. Corporate representatives visit occasionally. They inspect facilities, discuss labor needs. They see the striped uniforms, the thin faces. They understand the arrangement. Some ask questions about productivity. Few ask about conditions. The moral distance is bureaucratic. Inside the prisoner population, awareness grows that they are being worked to exhaustion deliberately. The phrase extermination through labor begins to circulate in whispers, though the formalized term may not yet be known to them. They feel it physically. Hands shake uncontrollably after shifts. Legs cramp at night. Minor injuries fester because rest is impossible. The infirmary fills faster. Doctors within the prisoner ranks struggle to provide care with limited supplies. Those too weak to return to labor risk being labeled unfit. Unfit can mean transport elsewhere, destinations unknown. Rumors of other camps circulate, places in the east where conditions are worse still. Names like Auschwitz and Treblinka begin to surface in hushed tones. The sense of interconnectedness between camps becomes clearer. Buchenwald is not isolated. It is one node in a sprawling system stretching across occupied Europe. The SS leadership, under Himmler, formalizes the economic role of camps. The SS Economic and Administrative Main Office oversees both concentration camps and industrial enterprises. The line between incarceration and enterprise blurs completely. Prisoners feel this shift daily. Where once punishment was the primary visible aim, now efficiency dominates. Guards measure productivity. Capos push work details harder to meet quotas. A slow worker endangers not just himself but the entire group. Punishments adapt accordingly. Instead of random beatings alone, collective penalties are imposed for missed targets. Extended shifts. Reduced rations. Public floggings in front of work crews. Fear is calibrated. The sound of machinery becomes constant background to suffering. And yet, within this industrialized brutality, resistance persists. Sabotage becomes a quiet weapon. In some workshops, prisoners subtly misalign parts. They weaken bolts. They introduce tiny flaws that may cause malfunction later. It is risky. Discovery can mean execution, but it is a way to strike back. Political prisoners, especially those with technical skills, coordinate such acts carefully. They understand the value of appearing productive while undermining output just enough to cause disruption. These efforts are small compared to the scale of production, but they represent agency in a system designed to erase it. In the subcamps, resistance is harder. Conditions are harsher. Oversight tighter. But even there, whispered networks attempt to support the weakest, to share extra food, to pass messages between sites. The human spirit adapts, even within mechanized exploitation. By 1943, Allied bombing intensifies further. The Reich's desperation increases. Production demands escalate. More subcamps are established. The prisoner population swells. Overcrowding in the main camp becomes severe. Barracks built for a few hundred now house many more. Sleep is shallow, interrupted by coughing, by nightmares, by the constant murmur of exhaustion. Water is scarce. Sanitation deteriorates. Disease spreads more rapidly in these conditions. Typhus outbreaks begin to loom as a threat. Yet production must continue. Even as prisoners weaken, they are marched to workshops. The whistle still sounds. The floodlights still hum. The iron inscription still waits above the gate. Jedem das Sein. To each his own. The phrase now echoes differently. To each his assigned quota. To each his calculated output. To each his measured worth in a war economy. The transformation is complete. Buchenwald is no longer primarily a site of intimidation or temporary detention. It is an industrial labor complex integrated into the heart of the German war machine. The men inside understand this instinctively. They feel in their bones. They are not merely imprisoned. They are being used. And as the war grinds on, as fronts collapse and territories shift, the pressure will only increase. Because the Reich will not accept defeat quietly. It will demand more production, more labor, more sacrifice from those behind the wire. And in that demand, the camp will be pushed toward even darker practices, including medical experimentation designed to maximize efficiency and survival at the front, regardless of the cost to those chosen as test subjects. The machinery hums louder now, but soon, another kind of experiment will begin inside these fences, one that turns prisoners' bodies themselves into laboratories. And once that threshold is crossed, the line between labor exploitation and scientific cruelty will dissolve completely. The room smells different. It is cleaner than the barracks. The floors are scrubbed. The windows are intact. There are instruments laid out on metal trays, glass vials, syringes, scalpels arranged with clinical precision. A white coat hangs over the back of a chair. On the wall, charts and notes are pinned in neat rows. Outside, the camp groans with hunger and exhaustion. Inside, the air is controlled. A prisoner is let in. He believes he is being examined. He has been told it is for medical reasons. Perhaps he has a fever. Perhaps he has been summoned without explanation. He stands uncertainly as a doctor adjusts his spectacles and gestures toward a table. This is Block 46, and Buchenwald is about to become something else. By the early 1940s, the camp's role in forced labor is firmly established. Industry hums. Subcamps multiply. But within the main compound, a new dimension of brutality begins to take shape, one cloaked in the language of science. Typhus has become a threat to the German war effort. The disease spreads easily in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, conditions common not only in camps but also on the Eastern Front. German troops operating in the Soviet Union face outbreaks. Military planners grow concerned. The SS leadership seeks solutions. At Buchenwald, under the authority of the camp administration and with support from the SS medical hierarchy, a program of human experimentation begins. The man at its center is Dr. Erwin Dingschuler, an SS physician assigned to conduct typhus vaccine trials. The justification is bureaucratic. To test vaccines effectively, subjects must be infected under controlled conditions. The subjects will be prisoners. Block 46 becomes the experimental ward. It is separate from the general infirmary. Access is restricted. Guards monitor entry and exit carefully. The block's windows look out onto the camp like any other, but inside, its purpose is singular. Prisoners selected for experimentation are often unaware of what awaits them. Some are chosen from among the weakest, those already ill. Others are selected because they are political prisoners deemed expendable. Nationality varies. Classification matters less here than availability. They are injected with typhus, sometimes deliberately infected through contaminated material, sometimes through direct inoculation. The fever begins within days. It starts with chills, violent and uncontrollable. Then heat, body temperature rising beyond comfort, beyond reason. Sweat soaks the thin camp uniform. Headaches pound behind the eyes. Delirium follows. Doctors and assistants observe carefully. Notes are taken. Charts updated. Symptoms recorded. Some prisoners receive experimental vaccines before infection. to measure efficacy. Others receive no protection at all, serving as control subjects. The logic is clinical. The suffering is not. Men writhe in narrow beds, sheets stained with sweat and blood. Their skin burns to the touch. Some cry out for water. Others mutter incoherently in their native languages. Nurses, often prisoner medical staff under SS supervision, are forced to assist. The smell inside Block 46 becomes distinct, antiseptic mingled with sickness, with human waste, with fear. Death rates are high. When a subject dies, the body is examined. Autopsies are conducted in adjacent facilities. Organs are studied. Samples preserved. The data is forwarded up the chain of command. The war demands results. Outside the block, life in Buchenwald continues as before. Roll calls, labor details, hunger. But whispers circulate about what happens behind those doors. Prisoner doctors working in the infirmary learn fragments of truth. They see the lists. They notice who is transferred to Block 46 and does not return. They observe patterns of fever among those selected. The moral weight is crushing. Some prisoner medical staff attempt quiet sabotage, altering records, mislabeling test results, reducing the virulence of infectious material when possible. It is dangerous. Discovery would mean execution. But small acts of resistance persist, even within the experimental ward. The SS doctors justify their work as necessary science. They speak of saving German soldiers from disease, of advancing medical knowledge, of serving the Reich. The language is detached. The reality is intimate and violent. And typhus is not the only focus. Other experiments follow. Some prisoners are subjected to testing of new medications. Others are exposed to pathogens under varying conditions. Blood samples are drawn repeatedly. Nutritional studies are conducted to determine minimal sustenance required for labor productivity. Human beings become variables. The transformation of Buchenwald into a site of medical experimentation does not happen in isolation. Across the camp system, similar programs operate. But at Buchenwald, the combination of forced labor, multinational prisoner population, and administrative sophistication makes it a convenient laboratory. The presence of skilled prisoner doctors adds complexity. Many political prisoners had been physicians before arrest. They now find themselves coerced into assisting experiments. Some attempt to mitigate harm where possible, providing water secretly, administering extra care after SS doctors leave. But they cannot stop the program. The experimental block operates under official sanction, and its existence marks a profound shift. Buchenwald is no longer merely exploiting prisoners for labor. It is consuming their bodies for research. Outside Block 46, the camp population grows further. In 1943 and 1944, Allied bombing intensifies over German cities. Industrial production is pushed deeper underground. Subcamps expand rapidly to support aircraft manufacturing and weapons assembly. The underground tunnel complexes become synonymous with death through exhaustion. Prisoners dig in near-total darkness, lungs filling with dust. They sleep in crude shelters carved into rock, air thick with moisture and chemical fumes. Yet even in these brutal sites, the shadow of medical experimentation lingers. Typhus outbreaks threaten production quotas. Vaccines developed through trials at Buchenwald are distributed to troops and occasionally to select prisoner groups when it serves economic interests. The paradox is stark. Prisoners are infected deliberately for research, while others die from uncontrolled outbreaks due to overcrowding and malnutrition. The camp administration tracks disease rates carefully. Health is not valued for its own sake. It is valued for productivity. If too many workers fall ill, output declines. Thus, the medical program becomes intertwined with labor management. The SS economic and administrative main office coordinates between medical departments and industrial demands. Efficiency governs all. Within the barracks, knowledge of the experiments deepens. Some prisoners try to avoid selection by appearing weaker or stronger, depending on rumor. Others accept that avoidance may be impossible. Fear sharpens every interaction. A summons to the infirmary, no longer suggests potential relief. It may signal a death sentence disguised as examination. Yet resistance networks do not collapse under this pressure. Political prisoners who hold administrative positions monitor transfer lists. When possible, they substitute names, sparing a comrade from selection. In one instance, a prisoner doctor deliberately misreports a test outcome to undermine the credibility of certain vaccine trials. It is a small victory, unnoticed beyond the camp walls. But such acts carry enormous risk. Discovery would mean hanging on the roll call square as a warning to all. The SS understands the power of spectacle. Public executions continue. Prisoners accused of sabotage or disobedience are displayed before assembled blocks. Nooses are tightened. The crowd is forced to watch. The message is consistent. Resistance will be crushed. And yet, the existence of Block 46 adds another layer to that message. Here, death does not require defiance. It requires only selection. The camp's moral center erodes further. Prisoners grapple with despair. Some retreat inward, conserving emotional energy for survival. Others cling to whispered hopes that the war may turn against Germany. News filters in sporadically. Allied landings in Italy. Soviet advances on the Eastern Front. Bombing campaigns intensifying. The world outside is shifting. Inside Buchenwald, the machinery of experimentation continues. Bodies are infected. Symptoms observed. Results recorded. The antiseptic smell of Block 46 lingers in the air long after each procedure ends. As 1944 progresses, the scale of suffering across Europe expands dramatically. Camps in occupied Poland operate as extermination centers. Deportations accelerate. Buchenwald begins receiving prisoners evacuated from camps closer to the advancing front. These arrivals are often emaciated beyond recognition, survivors of ghettos and death marches. They bring stories that confirm the worst fears. Mass shootings, gas chambers, entire communities erased. Compared to those sites, Buchenwald is not primarily an extermination camp. But death here is frequent and systemic, through labor, through disease, through execution, through experimentation. The lines blur. For those in Block 46, the distinction means little. They experience fever and delirium the same way, regardless of classification. And as the Reich faces mounting military setbacks, desperation intensifies. Medical experimentation does not cease. If anything, urgency increases. There is pressure to produce effective vaccines quickly, to demonstrate progress, to justify the suffering inflicted. The doctors document carefully. Some believe they are contributing to legitimate science. Others are fully aware that the foundation of their work is coercion and murder. History will judge them. But inside Buchenwald, judgment is distant. The whistle still sounds before dawn. Work details still march through the gate. And behind closed doors, syringes are filled. The transformation is complete. Buchenwald now encompasses political repression, racial persecution, industrial exploitation, and scientific cruelty. Each layer reinforces the other. Each layer deepens the camp's integration into the Nazi system. And as the war edges toward its final, catastrophic phase, the convergence of these functions will produce overcrowding and disease on a scale the camp has not yet experienced. The little camp, once a peripheral section, will soon swell with thousands of new arrivals, creating conditions so desperate that even seasoned prisoners will struggle to endure. Block 46 has shown how bodies can be used for research. What comes next will show how they can be discarded when the system begins to collapse under its own weight. The first thing you notice is the smell. It hits before you see the bodies. A thick, sour stench that hangs in the air like fog. Rot, sweat, sickness, waste. It seeps into clothing, into lungs, into memory. Even the guards wrinkle their noses when they pass. This is the little camp. Officially, it is a quarantine section, a holding area for new arrivals, a space meant to isolate disease. In reality, it is a camp within a camp, a place where overcrowding, starvation, and neglect create death without the need for bullets or injections. By late 1944, The war has turned against Germany. The Red Army pushes west. Allied forces advance from the west and south. Camps in occupied Poland begin to empty as the SS evacuates them ahead of the front lines. Prisoners are marched out in brutal columns or loaded on freight trains bound for the interior of the Reich. Buchenwald becomes a destination. Transports begin arriving at a pace the camp was never designed to handle. The trains pull in with a grinding of metal wheels. The doors slide open. Inside are men reduced to bone and skin, survivors of Auschwitz, Grossrosen, and other camps now threatened by advancing armies. Some have marched for days in snow before boarding. Others have been packed into rail cars without food or water. When they stumble onto the platform at Buchenwald, many collapse immediately. There is no ceremony, no time to process them properly. They are herded toward the little camp. The section was originally established as a quarantine area, separated from the main prisoner compound by additional fencing. Its barracks are older, poorly insulated, often unfinished. Windows are broken or covered with thin boards. The ground outside turns to mud after rain, to ice in winter. Now, thousands are crammed into a space meant for far fewer. Inside the barracks, bunks are stacked in tiers, but there are not enough for everyone. Some men sleep on bare floors. Others share bunks in shifts. Bodies pressed together so tightly that turning over becomes an effort requiring coordination. The air inside is suffocating. Ventilation is minimal. Lice infest clothing and bedding. Coughing echoes constantly. Deep, rattling coughs from chests already weakened by months or years of deprivation. Typhus spreads quickly in such conditions. The disease that had once been studied in Block 46 now rages uncontrolled through the little camp. Fever grips entire barracks at once. Men shake with chills, then burn with heat. Sweat pools beneath them, soaking thin blankets. Water is scarce. Latrines overflow. The smell becomes overwhelming. Prisoners assigned to remove bodies from the little camp begin working around the clock. Each morning, roll call reveals those who did not survive the night. Some die quietly in sleep. Others perish mid-fever, delirious, and alone despite the crowd around them. Corpses are dragged out by fellow inmates, too weak to lift properly. Limbs hang at unnatural angles. Eyes remain open. The dead are stacked near barracks until carts arrive. The crematorium struggles to keep pace. Smoke rises more frequently from its chimney. The little camp becomes synonymous with slow death. New arrivals often enter already on the brink. They bring stories of death marches, prisoners forced to walk through snow without adequate clothing, those who stumbled shot by guards along the roadside. These survivors, having endured one ordeal, now find themselves in a space where survival remains uncertain. Hunger deepens. Food distribution cannot keep up with the influx. Soup becomes even thinner. Bread portions shrink further. Some men fight over scraps. Others are too weak to care. Malnutrition reaches extreme levels. Faces become skeletal. Skin stretches taut over cheekbones. Eyes appear disproportionately large in hollow sockets. Prisoners from the main camp compound sometimes catch glimpses of the little camp through fencing. They know it is worse there. Whispers circulate. If you are sent to the little camp, you may not come back. The SS administration faces logistical strain. Overcrowding threatens disease spread beyond quarantine sections. Yet evacuations from eastern camps continue. The war's collapse drives prisoners westward in waves. Buchenwald swells beyond capacity. By early 1945, the camp holds tens of thousands. The little camp, originally peripheral, becomes central to the crisis. Prisoner resistance networks intensify efforts to assist those inside. Political prisoners with access to administrative roles attempt to secure transfers for the sick into slightly better conditions when possible. They smuggle small portions of food into quarantine barracks. They arrange for certain children and teenagers to be hidden in blocks less exposed to disease. One such block, later known as Block 66, becomes a refuge for some younger prisoners, a fragile shield against the worst conditions of the little camp. But resources are limited. Each act of protection requires deception. The SS grows increasingly paranoid as defeat looms. Executions continue. The Genexschussenlich, the neck shooting facility disguised as a medical examination room, operates in parallel. Soviet prisoners of war and others selected for execution are led in under false pretenses. A measuring device against the wall aligns the head. A concealed shooter fires into the back of the neck. The body drops silently. This system functions alongside the chaos of disease and starvation. Death has multiple pathways. In the little camp, however, bullets are often unnecessary. Typhus spreads rapidly. Delirium becomes common. Men speak to invisible figures. They relive memories aloud. They call out names of wives, of children, of cities far away. The sound of coughing never stops. The infirmary is overwhelmed. Prisoner doctors work beyond exhaustion. They lack adequate medication. They attempt to isolate the worst cases, but space is non-existent. Bandages are reused. Sheets are rarely washed. The smell of sickness saturates everything. Outside, winter tightens its grip. Snow falls on the Ettersberg. It blankets the barbed wire, softening its appearance from a distance. But inside the little camp, the cold penetrates thin walls easily. Men huddle together for warmth. Frost forms on window frames. Breath condenses in pale clouds. Some wake in the morning to find the man beside them stiff and cold. And still, transports arrive. The SS continues evacuating camps closer to the front. Buchenwald absorbs the overflow. Railcars arrive, filled beyond capacity. Some prisoners are already dead when doors open. Others crawl out, too weak to stand. They are directed toward the little camp without delay. Registration becomes superficial. Numbers are assigned hurriedly. Records are incomplete. The administrative machinery strains under volume. The camp that once prided itself on meticulous documentation now struggles to track its own population. Political prisoners understand the stakes. If the Allies arrive and find no record, the truth may be obscured. Thus, secret documentation intensifies. Prisoner clerks compile hidden lists of the dead. They record dates of arrival for evacuation transports. They gather evidence quietly, aware that history is unfolding rapidly. Inside the little camp, daily survival reduces life to basics. Find water. Secure a morsel of food. Avoid being trampled during distribution. Keep lice at bay if possible. Stay upright at roll call. Roll calls continue even for the sick. Men too weak to stand are propped up by others. If a prisoner collapses during count, he risks being marked as dead prematurely or beaten for failing to remain upright. The cruelty is both systemic and mundane. Guards sometimes avoid prolonged presence in the little camp due to disease risk. This creates pockets of relative autonomy within chaos. Prisoner functionaries wield more influence in these sections. Some abuse that power. Others use it to shield the most vulnerable. Children and adolescents among the arrivals are particularly fragile. Some are hidden deliberately in blocks with stronger support networks. Prisoner resistance groups recognize the symbolic importance of saving at least a few of the youngest inmates. One of those children is a teenage boy from Sayed in Transylvania, Elie Wiesel. He arrives with his father after surviving deportation and evacuation from Auschwitz. In Buchenwald, he witnesses the final unraveling of the camp system. The little camp leaves a permanent imprint on those who survive it. By March 1945, disease and starvation reach catastrophic levels. The crematorium operates almost continuously. Smoke drifts across the camp more frequently. The guards themselves appear strained. Allied forces draw closer. Bombing can be heard in the distance on some days. Faint thunder rolling over the hills. The SS faces a dilemma. Evacuate the camp entirely, destroy evidence, continue operations. Orders fluctuate. In early April, evacuation begins for some prisoners deemed fit to march. Columns are assembled. Men are forced onto roads leading south and west. Those too weak to keep pace are shot or left behind. The little camp, filled with the sick, becomes a question mark. What to do with thousands too ill to march? Confusion spreads among guards. Inside the barracks, prisoners sense something shifting. The atmosphere changes. Guards whisper among themselves. Some destroy documents. Others move supplies hurriedly. The prisoner resistance network, long preparing quietly, accelerates its plans. Weapons that have been smuggled piece by piece into the camp are hidden in strategic locations. The little camp remains a landscape of misery. But beneath that misery, a fragile thread of anticipation emerges. The war is collapsing around the Reich. American forces approach from the west. The sound of distant artillery grows clearer. For the men inside the little camp, survival until liberation is the only goal. Each night becomes a question. Will we live to see morning? Each morning becomes a miracle if one can stand. The smell remains. The coughing continues. But now, mixed with the stench of disease, there is something else in the air. Uncertainty. The camp has absorbed wave after wave of suffering. It has become overcrowded beyond imagination. It has witnessed starvation, experimentation, execution, industrial exploitation. Now it stands at the brink of collapse. The little camp, once an isolated quarantine section, has become the epicenter of Buchenwald's final crisis. And in the days ahead, as evacuation chaos deepens and guards begin to flee, the prisoners themselves will face a choice. Wait passively for liberation, or seize it. The floodlights still burn at night. The electric fence still hums. But the sound of approaching artillery is no longer distant. And when the gates finally open, what lies inside the little camp will shock the world. The door closes softly. There is no dramatic slam, no shouted order. Just a quiet click as it seals behind the man who has been told he is here for a routine examination. He stands inside a small room with pale walls. A measuring device is mounted near the doorway. A man in a white coat gestures calmly, instructing him to step forward, to place his head against the marked board. It happens in less than a second. A hidden mechanism behind the wall fires a bullet into the base of his skull. His body drops instantly. There is no trial. No witness beyond the few required to operate the system. Another name disappears from the rolls. This is the Kristallnacht. And in Buchenwald, killing has been engineered for efficiency. By the early 1940s, as the war intensifies and the camp expands, execution becomes formalized. It is no longer limited to public beatings or sporadic shootings along the fence line. It is organized, scheduled, documented. The SS views certain categories of prisoners as irredeemable. Soviet prisoners of war top that list. When Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941, ideological hatred fuses with military policy. Soviet soldiers are not treated as conventional POWs under international law. They are labeled political enemies, Bolsheviks, racially inferior. In Buchenwald, their fate is often sealed upon arrival. Transports of Soviet POWs arrive under heavy guard. They are separated from other prisoners quickly. Some are marched directly toward what appears to be a medical examination facility near the crematorium. The ruse is deliberate. The room is designed to resemble a standard processing station. The measuring device mounted against the wall serves as both distraction and alignment tool. A hidden shooter stands behind the partition. The system is efficient. The victim is instructed to stand upright for height measurement. His head is positioned precisely. The shot is fired from behind, directly into the neck. The bullet travels upward into the brain, causing immediate death. The body is removed swiftly. Another prisoner is brought in. Over weeks and months, thousands of Soviet POWs are killed in this manner. The shots are muffled, but not entirely silent. Prisoners working nearby hear dull cracks echoing through walls. They notice the steady stream of bodies being transported to the crematorium. Whispers spread. Some prisoner clerks in the administrative offices manage to glimpse lists of Soviet arrivals marked with coded notations. They memorize numbers. They pass fragments of information through clandestine networks. The executions are not random. They are ordered. Records exist within SS files documenting special treatment, Sonderbehandlung, a euphemism that has become synonymous with execution. The Kristallnacht represents a chilling evolution in Buchenwald's function. Death is no longer simply a byproduct of starvation or labor. It is systematic. Yet public executions continue as well. The roll call square remains a stage for spectacle. Prisoners accused of sabotage, escape attempts, or disobedience are brought before assembled blocks. A gallows stands ready. Guards tighten ropes deliberately. The condemned is forced to face fellow inmates. The SS understands the psychological impact of forcing prisoners to witness death. It reinforces control. Silence blankets the square as the stool is kicked away. Some men turn their eyes downward. Others stare rigidly forward. The body swings slowly, boots brushing the gravel. The message is unmistakable. Inside the camp, punishment can take many forms. For minor infractions, prisoners may be confined to the bunker, dark, airless cells where days blur into one another. Food is reduced further. Light barely penetrates. The smell is suffocating. For more serious charges, flogging remains common. The whipping post stands as a permanent reminder. But the hidden execution room marks a deeper threshold. It is quiet, administrative, bureaucratic, and it reflects a broader shift across the Nazi camp system toward concealed killing mechanisms. Buchenwald does not have gas chambers like those in extermination camps in occupied Poland. It is not primarily designed for industrial mass murder in that specific form, but its killing apparatus is nonetheless methodical. The crematorium operates continuously. Its ovens burn day and night during peak periods of execution and disease outbreaks. The smoke drifts over the camp, sometimes settling faintly on barack roofs. Prisoners assigned to crematorium detail endure a unique psychological burden. They handle bodies daily. They strip clothing, search for hidden valuables, place corpses into ovens. They witness the scale firsthand. Some attempt to record what they see. Names, dates, categories. Because they understand that if the camp falls, evidence must survive. Executions are not limited to Soviet POWs. Polish resistance members, captured French fighters, and even German political prisoners accused of renewed subversion are sometimes selected. In times of heightened tension, after sabotage incidents in workshops, for example, the SS responds with severity. One man's alleged act can trigger multiple hangings. Collective punishment reinforces compliance. The underground resistance within Buchenwald recognizes the danger. Sabotage must be subtle. Too obvious, and executions follow. Too cautious, and the war machine remains unchallenged. It is a delicate balance. Meanwhile, the little camp continues to swell with disease and starvation. Some prisoners deemed too weak to work are quietly transferred to execution facilities rather than allowed to die naturally. Efficiency governs all. The administrative mindset reduces death to a process. In certain cases, prisoners are told they are being moved to another camp for lighter work. They are instead led to the execution room. The deception deepens the cruelty. Trust erodes completely. A summons can mean medical treatment, or it can mean a bullet. The sound of gunfire, though muffled, becomes part of the camp's soundscape. It blends with factory machinery, with coughing from overcrowded barracks, with the steady hum of electric fences. Death becomes ambient. Yet even within this environment, humanity flickers. When a prisoner is led to the gallows, some inmates risk murmuring a final word of solidarity. A brief nod, a whispered courage. These gestures are small but defiant. The resistance network grows more organized as the war turns. Political prisoners, particularly communists with experience in clandestine coordination, consolidate influence in certain blocks. They place trusted individuals in administrative roles when possible. They gather intelligence about execution orders. They attempt, occasionally, to delay or reroute transfers. But the SS maintains ultimate authority. The camp's command structure ensures that orders from Berlin are carried out. By 1944, as Allied forces land in Normandy and Soviet troops advance from the east, executions intensify in some areas. The regime seeks to eliminate potential witnesses. In Buchenwald, Prisoners sense the approaching end of war, but they also understand that the final months may be the most dangerous. The SS has shown willingness to kill preemptively. Rumors circulate of other camps being evacuated violently, of prisoners shot en masse rather than liberated. This knowledge fuels urgency within the resistance. Weapons are smuggled into the camp in pieces, small firearms, ammunition, hidden tools. The plan is not yet activated, but exists. Inside the execution room, however, the routine continues. The measuring board remains mounted. The concealed shooter stands ready. Bodies are carried out. The crematorium's fires burn. The moral abyss has widened. Buchenwald now encompasses nearly every form of Nazi camp brutality, political repression, racial persecution, forced labor, medical experimentation, disease, and systematic execution. Each function reinforces the others. The prisoners live in a state of constant calculation. Stand straight at roll call. Work hard enough to avoid punishment. Avoid attention. Yet attention is not always avoidable. An accusation can arise without evidence. A guard's suspicion can be enough. The boundary between life and death is thin. And as 1945 approaches, the front lines draw closer to central Germany. Bombing can be heard in the distance more frequently. Supply shortages affect even SS personnel. Anxiety flickers in the behavior of guards. Some grow more volatile. Others seem distracted. The prisoners notice. The underground leadership convenes quietly in corners of barracks. They discuss timing. They assess numbers. They monitor the movement of SS units in and out of the camp. The execution apparatus continues operating, but the system itself is beginning to strain. The question is no longer whether prisoners will die. It is whether they will die before liberation arrives. Because the war's final chapter is closing in, the roll call square still hosts hangings. The execution room still claims victims. The crematorium chimney still releases smoke into the cold air. But beyond the barbed wire, American forces advance steadily. Artillery grows louder. The guards know it. The prisoners know it. And as the possibility of freedom inches closer, the SS faces a decision. Evacuate, destroy evidence, or kill as many as possible before the gates fall. The measuring board still waits on the wall. But time is running out. And soon, the camp that perfected execution will confront something it has not faced before. Armed prisoners ready to seize control rather than walk quietly toward death. The order comes in fragments. It is not shouted across the roll call square. It does not arrive with a trumpet blast or formal proclamation. It moves quietly through SS offices, through whispered conversations between guards, through hurried paperwork burned in stoves. Evacuation. By early April 1945, the Reich is collapsing. American forces push eastward through Germany. The Red Army advances relentlessly from the opposite direction. Cities fall. Communication lines fracture. The illusion of permanence that once surrounded Buchenwald begins to crumble. Inside the camp, the prisoners sense it before it is confirmed. The guards are different. Some are agitated, pacing with restless energy. Others seem distracted, glancing toward the horizon more often than toward the barracks. The sound of distant artillery no longer resembles thunder. It is distinct, rhythmic, closer each day. The underground resistance within Buchenwald has been preparing for this moment for years. Political prisoners, many of them German communists with experience in clandestine organization, have built networks block by block. They have placed trusted men in administrative positions. They have smuggled weapons in pieces over time, pistols concealed in tool shipments, ammunition hidden in workshop supplies, knives fashioned from scrap metal. Now, those networks activate quietly. Lists are reviewed. Guard rotations are observed carefully. Stockpiles of hidden weapons are checked in secret. But the SS moves first. In the first days of April, orders are issued to begin evacuating prisoners deemed fit to march. Columns are assembled on the roll call square. The sight is haunting. Thousands of men line up, skeletal beneath striped uniforms. Some can barely stand. Others brace themselves for what they know will be a march through chaos. The SS does not intend to surrender prisoners to advancing armies easily. Evacuation is both strategic and destructive. Those strong enough to walk are driven out through the gates in long columns. Guards march alongside with rifles ready. The destination is uncertain. Further south, deeper into what remains of German-held territory. The prisoners know what evacuation often means. They have heard stories from other camps. Death marches. Men forced to walk for days without adequate food. Those who stumble are shot and left by the roadside. Those who cannot rise again are abandoned. The first column leaves Buchenwald under gray skies. Boots scrape against gravel as the gate swings open. Jedem Dasein. The inscription watches silently as thousands disappear down the road. Inside the camp, confusion spreads. Not everyone is selected for evacuation. The sick in the little camp are largely left behind. Many are too weak to march. The SS faces a logistical dilemma. Transporting tens of thousands is impossible. As columns depart, the camp grows emptier in places, yet remains overcrowded in others. Smoke still rises from the crematorium. Disease still ravages the quarantine barracks. But something fundamental shifts. The guard presence thins. Certain watchtowers are less consistently manned. Patrol patterns change. Some SS personnel quietly remove personal belongings from their quarters. The underground resistance notices every detail. In secret meetings inside barracks, leaders debate timing. Should they rise immediately? Or wait for the right moment? Weapons are distributed carefully. Small arms are assigned to trusted men. Signals are agreed upon. The camp radio, hidden by resistance members, begins to pick up clearer reports of American advances. The sound of artillery grows unmistakable now. Shells explode in the distance. Windows tremble faintly. Prisoners in the little camp lift their heads when they hear the distant booms. Could it be? Hope is dangerous in Buchenwald. It has been crushed too often, yet flickers. Meanwhile, evacuation continues. More columns are assembled. Guards grow harsher as panic creeps into their ranks. They understand that defeat may bring consequences. Some attempt to destroy records. Files are burned in administrative offices. Documents are shredded. Evidence of execution orders is removed where possible. But the prisoner clerks have anticipated this. Hidden copies of lists exist. Names of the dead have been memorized. The resistance is not only preparing to seize the camp, it is preparing to testify. On April 11, 1945, the situation reaches a breaking point. In the morning hours, more prisoners are ordered to assemble for evacuation. But chaos interrupts the process. American forces are reported to be within kilometers. Some SS units receive conflicting instructions. Stay. Flee. Destroy the camp. The chain of command fractures. Within Buchenwald, resistance leaders recognize the moment. If they wait too long, remaining SS units may massacre those left behind. If they act too soon, they risk failure without external support. The signal is sent. Hidden weapons are retrieved. Prisoners move quickly but carefully through the compound. Watchtowers are targeted first. Resistance fighters, many of them former soldiers or trained activists, position themselves strategically. They know the layout intimately. A shot rings out, then another. The sound echoes across the camp. Some guards fire back. Others flee immediately. Confusion engulfs the compound. Prisoners surge toward key points: the armory, the gates, administrative offices. The Red Triangle prisoners, long at the core of underground organization, coordinate movements block by block. The little camp hears the gunfire. Men too weak to stand lift their heads in disbelief. Is this another execution? Or something else? Within hours, resistance fighters seize control of significant portions of the camp. White flags appear on some structures. Remaining SS personnel either escape into surrounding woods or surrender. The electric fence still hums, but its authority has collapsed. For the first time since 1937, the prisoners control Buchenwald. The gates are not yet open. American troops have not yet entered. But inside the perimeter, the balance of power has shifted. Prisoners armed with captured rifles climb watchtowers. They scan the horizon. The camp siren, once a symbol of discipline, now sounds in a different tone. Liberation is not yet official, but the regime's grip has broken. Inside the little camp, word spreads slowly. Some cannot comprehend it. They are too sick, too delirious. Others weep quietly. In the main compound, resistance leaders establish order quickly. Guards who surrendered are detained. Weapons are collected. They know that chaos could invite disaster. They must hold the camp until Allied forces arrive. And then, in the afternoon of April 11, 1945, American tanks appear on the roads leading toward the Ettersburg. The sound is unmistakable. Engines rumble heavily. Dust rises in the distance. Prisoners crowd near the gates, some climbing fences despite weakness. When the first American soldiers enter the camp, they are confronted with a sight beyond anything they have seen. Thousands of skeletal figures. Barracks overflowing with the sick. The little camp's stench overpowering. Bodies stacked near crematoriums. The Americans move cautiously at first, weapons raised. Then the reality settles. The war has revealed one of its darkest chambers. Prisoners cheer weakly. Some attempt to embrace the soldiers. Others collapse from exhaustion and relief. For the resistance leaders, the moment is complex. They have liberated themselves in part, but the cost is visible everywhere. Overcrowding, disease, mass graves. The American troops begin documenting immediately. Photographs are taken. Film cameras roll. Evidence is preserved. The measuring board in the execution room still hangs on the wall. The crematorium ovens are still warm. Block 46 remains intact. The little camp stands as a monument to neglect and cruelty. Liberation does not erase suffering instantly. Many prisoners are too ill to recover. Typhus continues to spread. Medical teams rush to contain outbreaks. Food must be distributed carefully to avoid shock to starving bodies. Some men die even after freedom arrives. Their systems too damaged to sustain life. The SS guards who fled are pursued. Those captured face interrogation. The camp command structure collapses entirely. For the first time in 8 years, the floodlights will not be turned on by SS order. The whistle will not dictate the morning. Jedem das Sein remains above the gate. Its irony now unbearable. To each his own. What had been delivered to these men was not justice, but calculated cruelty. And yet, in the final hours, prisoners chose resistance. They refused to be marched into oblivion. They seized control. They waited for the world to see. The liberation of Buchenwald sends shockwaves through Allied command. Images and reports circulate rapidly. The existence of camps can no longer be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. Proofs stand in plain view. But liberation also raises immediate questions. Who will be held accountable? How will justice be pursued? What will become of the camp itself? The men who survived must now transition from prisoners to witnesses. Their testimonies will shape the world's understanding of what occurred on the Ettersburg. But before courts convene, before memorials are built, before history is written, there are days of raw reckoning. American soldiers walk through the little camp and struggle to comprehend the scale of neglect. They interview survivors. They confront local German civilians from Weimar, forcing them to walk through the compound and see what stood on the hill above their town. The smell lingers. The crematorium stands silent. The measuring board remains on its wall. The floodlights, once symbols of surveillance, now illuminate evidence. The regime that built Buchenwald has fallen, but its consequences will echo for decades. The camp story is not over. Liberation marks an end to imprisonment, but not to memory. Trials will follow. Testimonies will be recorded. And the question of how such a system was allowed to exist so visibly, so methodically, so near the heart of German culture, will haunt Europe and the world. The gates are open now, but the reckoning is just beginning. The gates are open, but the smell does not disappear. Liberation does not clear the air. It does not silence the coughing. It does not empty the infirmary or cool the crematorium ovens overnight. When American soldiers first walked through Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, They step into a space that is technically free, but still saturated with death. The prisoners are no longer under SS command, but they are not yet safe. Inside the little camp, typhus still rages. Men lie stacked in bunks, too weak to lift their heads. Some whisper for water. Others stare blankly, minds suspended between delirium and awareness. Their bodies are so starved that even liberation feels distant. The American medical units move quickly. They set up triage stations. They isolate the most severe typhus cases. They bring in disinfectant, vaccines, fresh water. They order that food be distributed carefully. Too much too quickly could kill a body that has forgotten how to process nourishment. Soldiers who have seen battlefields pause in silence. They are trained for combat, for artillery, for trenches. But this is different. There are no explosions here. Only bones under skin, eyes too large for their faces, silence broken by coughing. The camera crews arrive almost immediately. Film reels capture the barracks, the stacks of corpses, the crematorium ovens. Photographers document the measuring board in the execution room, the iron inscription on the gate, the piles of striped uniforms. The world will see this. But first, the world must understand what it is looking at. American officers order that local civilians from Weimar be brought to the camp. Men and women from the town, some who claimed ignorance, some who lived within sight of the Ettersberg, are marched through the gates. They walk past barracks where skeletal survivors stare back at them. They cover their noses against the stench. Some weep. Others remain rigid, expressions unreadable. They are shown the crematorium. They are shown the piles of bodies not yet burned. The confrontation is deliberate. The Allies want to ensure that denial cannot take root immediately. Inside Buchenwald, however, survival remains the immediate concern. Despite liberation, prisoners continue to die. Typhus spreads faster in overcrowded conditions. Medical staff struggle to contain it. American doctors work alongside former prisoner physicians, combining resources and experience. Food becomes medicine, but must be rationed carefully. Many liberated prisoners are too weak to eat solid food. Broth is administered slowly. Some bodies reject nourishment entirely. They have been starved for too long. In the first days after liberation, dozens, even hundreds die. Freedom has arrived too late for them. The American command realizes that Buchenwald is both a humanitarian emergency and a crime scene. Evidence must be preserved. Survivors must be interviewed while memories remain vivid. Lists of the dead must be reconstructed. Prisoner resistance leaders step forward. They explain how they organized secretly, how they smuggled weapons, how they seized the camp before the final SS units could destroy it. Their role in the uprising becomes a central narrative. But liberation is not simply triumph. It is also disorientation. For years, prisoners' lives were structured by whistles, by roll calls, by work details. Now there is no schedule, no command. Some wander aimlessly between barracks, unsure where to go. Others sit in silence, absorbing the absence of guards. The electric fence still stands, but it no longer hums with authority. The floodlights remain, but they are no longer instruments of control. The inscription above the gate, Jedem das Sein, remains in place. Its irony cuts deeper now than ever. American soldiers begin documenting testimonies. Men recount the execution room, disguised as a medical facility. They describe Block 46 and the typhus experiments. They speak of the little camp starvation, of death marches, of public hangings on the roll call square. Some speak calmly. Others tremble as they recount details. Each testimony adds weight. The Allies understand that trials will follow. Those responsible must be held accountable. Within weeks, investigations begin in earnest. SS officers captured near the camp are interrogated. Records recovered from partially burned offices are examined. The chain of command is mapped carefully. The name Karl Otto Koch surfaces again, the former commandant who had already been removed and tried by the SS for corruption before the war's end. His successor, Hermann Piester, is identified as responsible for the camp during its final years. Medical personnel associated with Block 46 are also traced. Dr. Erwin Dingschuler's role in the typhus experiments becomes a focal point. The Allies recognize that Buchenwald is not an isolated atrocity. It is part of a system. The Nuremberg trials, convened later in 1945, will prosecute high-ranking Nazi officials for crimes against humanity. But beyond Nuremberg, specific camp trials are organized. The Buchenwald trial, held by an American military tribunal in Dachau in 1947, brings former camp personnel before the court. Witnesses testify. Survivors describe the execution apparatus, the medical experiments, the forced labor conditions. Evidence includes photographs taken at liberation, recovered documents, and physical remnants of the camp's infrastructure. Defendants claim they were following orders. They argue that they were part of a system beyond their control. The tribunal rejects these defenses. Sentences are handed down. Some are condemned to death. Others receive lengthy prison terms. Justice, though imperfect, begins. Meanwhile, Buchenwald itself enters a new phase. The war in Europe has ended, but Germany is divided into occupation zones. The camp lies in what becomes the Soviet zone. In August 1945, the Soviet NKVD establishes a new special camp on the same site, Special Camp No. 2. The barbed wire remains. The barracks are reused, but the prisoners are different. Now they include former Nazis, suspected collaborators, political opponents of Soviet authorities, and individuals caught in the complex upheaval of post-war Germany. The irony is stark. A site of Nazi repression becomes a site of Soviet internment. Conditions are harsh, though not identical to those under the SS. Disease spreads again. Food is scarce. Thousands die between 1945 and 1950. For survivors of the Nazi era, the reuse of Buchenwald is a painful reminder that the hill's history is not easily erased. In 1950, the Soviet special camp closes. The site begins a gradual transformation into a memorial. In East Germany, Buchenwald becomes a symbol of anti-fascist resistance. The narrative emphasizes the communist prisoners' role in organizing and liberating the camp. Monuments are constructed. A large memorial complex is built in the 1950s, featuring statues of resistance fighters standing defiantly. The crematorium remains. The gate remains. But interpretation is shaped by the politics of the Cold War. Certain victim groups receive more emphasis than others. The complexity of prisoner categories, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, is sometimes overshadowed by the focus on political resistance. In West Germany, discussions of responsibility unfold differently. Public confrontation with the Nazi past evolves slowly. Photographs from Buchenwald and other camps circulate internationally, shaping global understanding of the Holocaust and the concentration camp system. For survivors, memory becomes both burden and duty. Elie Wiesel, who survived Buchenwald as a teenager, writes of his experiences years later. Other survivors testify in trials, in memoirs, in interviews. Their voices ensure that Buchenwald is not reduced to statistics. Because statistics cannot capture the smell of the little camp, the sound of coughing in overcrowded barracks, the metallic echo of a concealed gunshot behind a measuring board. In the decades that follow, Buchenwald becomes a place of pilgrimage and education. School groups walk through the gate. They stand beneath the inscription. They visit the crematorium. They read names engraved on memorial plaques. The hill above Weimar, once a forest, once a camp, becomes a site of reflection. But reflection does not erase the past. The buildings remain in part. The roll call square is still gravel. The watchtowers stand as silhouettes against the sky. Visitors often remark on the proximity to Weimar, the cultural heart of German literature and philosophy. How could such brutality exist so near a town associated with Goethe and Schiller? The question lingers. The answer lies not in geography, but in ideology. Buchenwald was not hidden deep in inaccessible wilderness. It operated in visible proximity to civilian life. It functioned because a regime normalized exclusion, dehumanization, and violence step by step. Liberation did not close that chapter instantly. It opened a new one, one of memory, accountability, and interpretation. Trials addressed some perpetrators. Memorials honored some victims. But the moral reckoning extended beyond courtrooms. It entered classrooms, political discourse, and international law. The phrase crimes against humanity gained weight in part because of places like Buchenwald. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, emerged in a world newly aware of how states could weaponize bureaucracy and ideology against their own populations. Buchenwald's legacy thus stretches far beyond its barbed wire. It is a warning about the normalization of cruelty, about the efficiency of dehumanization, about how quickly a forest can become a camp. But even as memorials rise and survivors speak, questions remain. How do societies prevent repetition? How do individuals resist incremental injustice before it solidifies into a system? The gate still stands on the Ettersberg. The words still face inward. Visitors read them in silence. To each his own. What was once intended as mockery has become indictment. Liberation exposed the horror. Trials pursue justice. Memorials preserve memory. But the responsibility to remember does not end. Because the story of Buchenwald is not only about the years between 1937 and 1945. It is about what allowed those years to unfold. And in the next chapter of its history, the focus will turn fully to remembrance, to how a place of engineered cruelty becomes a site of education, and whether memory can truly guard against forgetting. The gate still stands. Wind moves through it the same way it did in 1937, in 1945, in every year since. The iron letters remain fixed in place, their edges rusted slightly now, but still legible. Jedem das saying, to each his own. But the silence is different. There are no guards pacing beneath the watchtowers. No whistles slicing through dawn. No columns of striped figures assembling on the gravel. Instead, there are footsteps, measured, hesitant, reflective. School groups, survivors, historians, children who were born decades after the war. The camp has become a memorial. Yet the transformation was neither immediate nor simple. After the Soviet special camp closed in 1950, the German Democratic Republic inherited a landscape saturated with death. The new East German state faced a choice: erase the site or reshape it into a narrative that aligned with its identity. They chose remembrance, but remembrance through a specific lens. In the 1950s, large-scale construction began on a memorial complex at Buchenwald. Barracks were removed selectively. Certain structures were preserved. Others were demolished to create space for monumental sculpture. The East German government framed Buchenwald as a symbol of anti-fascist resistance. The narrative centered heavily on communist prisoners who had organized clandestinely within the camp and ultimately seized control in the final days before American liberation. There was truth in this emphasis. The underground resistance had indeed played a decisive role in preventing total evacuation or massacre. Political prisoners, particularly communists, had risked their lives to build networks, hide weapons, and protect vulnerable inmates. But the camp had also held Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet POWs, French resistance fighters, and countless others. In the early decades of memorialization, some of these victim groups received less attention in official narratives. The Cold War shaped memory. East Germany presented itself as the anti-fascist successor to the Nazi regime, contrasting its identity with that of West Germany. Buchenwald became part of that ideological positioning. A massive monument was erected overlooking the former campgrounds. Stone figures, sculpted in dramatic poses, represented defiant prisoners, some holding children, others raising clenched fists. The message was clear: resistance triumphed over fascism. The crematorium remained intact. The gate remained. But the emphasis was on heroism as much as on victimhood. For survivors, reactions were mixed. Some embraced the recognition of resistance. Others worried that the complexity of suffering was being simplified. Meanwhile, in West Germany, public reckoning with the Nazi past evolved more slowly. The Buchenwald trial had established legal accountability for some perpetrators, but broader societal reflection was gradual. Photographs from liberation circulated internationally. Memoirs were published. Survivors spoke publicly. Yet many former Nazis reintegrated into society quietly. The divide between East and West Germany created parallel narratives of responsibility and memory. At Buchenwald itself, guided tours emphasized anti-fascist solidarity. Schoolchildren from across the Eastern Bloc visited regularly. Ceremonies were held annually. The site became part of civic education. But memory is never static. After German reunification in 1990, Buchenwald entered a new phase. The Cold War lens dissolved. Historians revisited archives. Curators reassessed exhibitions. The memorial's narrative expanded to encompass the full spectrum of victims. Jewish suffering received greater emphasis. The Roma and Sinti experience was acknowledged. The persecution of homosexual prisoners was addressed more openly. The story of the Soviet special camp from 1945 to 1950 was integrated into the site's history. Because Buchenwald's past did not end with liberation. The reuse of the camp by Soviet authorities raised difficult questions about continuity and rupture. Thousands had died there under a different regime. Memory had to accommodate layers. Walking through Buchenwald today means moving through time. The roll call square remains vast and exposed. Gravel crunches underfoot, just as it did beneath the boots of prisoners standing for hours in freezing wind. The foundations of barracks are marked by low stone outlines. Block 46 is preserved as a reminder of medical experimentation. The execution room, near the crematorium, still holds the measuring board against the wall. Visitors stand silently before it, imagining the final seconds of those led inside. The crematorium ovens are cold now, but their presence remains undeniable. Names of the dead are inscribed in memorial spaces. Lists compiled secretly by prisoner clerks during the war help identify victims. The work of documentation that began in whispers continues through archival research and public education. Survivors return when they can. Some walk slowly through the gates, pausing beneath the inscription. They point to specific corners. Here was my barack. Here we stood for roll call. Here they hanged a friend. Their voices carry memory in ways that monuments cannot. Elie Wiesel returned to Buchenwald later in life. He stood again on the Ettersberg Hill, reflecting on the teenage boy who had once arrived there emaciated and terrified. His testimony became part of global Holocaust education. As survivor generations age, urgency grows. Memorial staff record interviews meticulously. Artifacts are preserved carefully. Striped uniforms, tools from workshops, fragments of letters written secretly by prisoners. Education programs expand. Workshops explore not only what happened, but how it happened. How ordinary administrative language facilitated cruelty. How ideology framed neighbors as enemies. How incremental normalization paved the way for systemic violence. Visitors are encouraged to confront uncomfortable questions. What would you have done? How do societies slide from prejudice into persecution? Buchenwald stands not only as a place of mourning, but as a warning. The forest that once covered Ettersberg has partially returned around the memorial complex. Birds nest in trees near the old watchtower foundations. The contrast between natural beauty and historical horror remains striking. It is easy, on a clear day, to imagine how the camp once looked from afar, just buildings on a hill near Weimar. And that proximity remains central to understanding. Buchenwald was not hidden in distant wilderness. It operated near a town synonymous with German cultural heritage. The lesson is uncomfortable. Civilization and brutality can coexist geographically. Memory must therefore confront not only perpetrators, but bystanders. Post-war Germany's reckoning included debates over collective guilt and individual responsibility. Buchenwald's preserved structures provide tangible evidence. It is harder to deny what stands before you. The memorial also addresses the Soviet special camp period more openly now. Exhibitions explain the NKVD's use of the site after 1945. Photographs and documents show detainees in the early post-war years. This layered history complicates simplistic narratives. Buchenwald is not only a Nazi camp. It is a site where multiple regimes exercise power over confined populations. Acknowledging that complexity strengthens, rather than weakens, its significance. International visitors arrive year-round. Delegations from countries whose citizens were imprisoned here lay wreaths. Names are read aloud in ceremonies. Each name resists reduction to number. Educational initiatives emphasize human stories. The child hidden in Block 66. The prisoner doctor who falsified a record to save a life. The resistance leader who coordinated the uprising. The Soviet POW shot in the execution room. The French worker forced into underground tunnels. The Jewish businessman arrested after Kristallnacht. Each narrative intersects at Buchenwald. The site's curators face ongoing challenges. How to balance commemoration with historical rigor. How to present graphic realities without overwhelming visitors. How to speak to new generations whose connection to the Second World War grows more distant each year. Technology plays a role. Digital archives allow global access to documents and testimonies. Virtual tours expand reach beyond physical visitors. Yet nothing replaces standing on the gravel of the roll call square, feeling the wind, seeing the distance to Weimar's rooftops. The inscription above the gate remains controversial. Some argue it should be removed. Others insist it must stay as historical evidence. For now, it remains, a stark reminder of language twisted into justification. As decades pass, Buchenwald's significance evolves. It is no longer only a symbol of Nazi terror. It is a site of layered memory, a place where the 20th century's extremes, fascism, war, occupation, Cold War division, intersect physically. Its continued existence challenges complacency. It asks visitors to consider how fragile democratic norms can be, how quickly rights can be suspended, how easily bureaucracies can rationalize cruelty. The memorial does not offer simple comfort. It offers confrontation. In classrooms across Germany and beyond, Buchenwald is studied as part of Holocaust education. Students read survivor accounts. They analyze propaganda language. They examine photographs from liberation. They visit the site when possible. Each generation must rediscover the meaning, because memory fades if not tended. The survivors who once guided tours are fewer now. Their absence places greater responsibility on institutions and educators. But the landscape itself speaks. The foundations of barracks outline absence. The crematorium stands as testimony. The execution room's measuring board still clings to the wall, and the wind continues to move through the gate. Chapter by chapter, Buchenwald's story has unfolded. From forest to prison, from repression to industrial exploitation, from experimentation to execution, from liberation to memorialization. Yet even now, the story is not complete. Memory must contend with denial, distortion, and the passage of time. In the next chapter, the focus turns to the voices that carried Buchenwald beyond the Ettersberg, the survivors whose words transformed local horror into global awareness, and the way their testimonies reshaped how the world understands genocide itself. He is standing in a courtroom now, not on a roll call square. There is no barbed wire above him, no watchtower casting a shadow. Instead, there are polished wooden benches, microphones, rows of faces turned toward him in silence. He clears his throat. His hands tremble slightly, not from hunger this time, but from memory. He begins to speak. His voice is steady at first. He describes the arrival, the shaving of his head, the first night in the barracks when he could not sleep because of coughing and the smell of sickness. He speaks of the little camp, of bodies stacked like cordwood, of his father's final breath beside him. The courtroom listens. This is no longer Buchenwald, the physical camp. This is Buchenwald, the testimony. After liberation, survivors carried more than scars. They carried memory, and memory would become one of the most powerful weapons against forgetting. In the months immediately following April 1945, American investigators recorded statements from former prisoners. The goal was immediate: gather evidence for trials, document crimes, establish accountability. But those early depositions were only the beginning. As survivors returned to their home countries, or discovered there were no homes left, they faced a new reality. How do you speak about what happened on the Ettersberg? How do you describe the smell of the little camp? The sound of the concealed gunshot behind the measuring board? The hollow eyes of men who had not eaten properly in months? Some remained silent for years. The trauma was too raw. Others began writing almost immediately. Memoirs emerged in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Some were published in small editions. Others circulated quietly within survivor communities. These early accounts preserved details that might otherwise have faded. Names of blocks, faces of capos, the texture of the gravel under bare feet during roll call. In France, former resistance fighters imprisoned at Buchenwald spoke publicly about the camp's network of clandestine organization. They emphasized solidarity, collective action, the refusal to surrender dignity, even in extremity. In Eastern Europe, Soviet survivors returned to countries now reshaped by new political systems. Some were honored as anti-fascist fighters. Others faced suspicion, particularly those who had been prisoners of war. In Germany, both East and West, the presence of survivors complicated post-war narratives. Their existence was proof. They were living evidence that the camp had operated within sight of towns, within reach of ordinary citizens. One of the most influential survivor voices to emerge from Buchenwald was Elie Wiesel. As a teenager, he had arrived at the camp after surviving Auschwitz and a death march. He witnessed his father's death in the final months before liberation. Years later, he would write about that time in his memoir, Night. The book's quiet, restrained prose conveyed horror without embellishment. It brought Buchenwald into classrooms across the world. Through Wiesel's words, readers felt the cold of the barracks, the silence of despair, the moral confusion of survival. He did not describe Buchenwald as an abstract symbol. He described it as lived experience. And in doing so, he ensured that the camp would not become a footnote. Other survivors contributed in different ways. Some testified in the Buchenwald trial in Dachau, confronting former SS personnel directly. They pointed across the courtroom and identified guards who had beaten them, doctors who had conducted experiments, administrators who had signed execution orders. The act of identification was itself powerful. It reversed the dynamic of the camp. The prisoner now named the perpetrator. Yet justice was imperfect. Some convicted SS men had their sentences reduced in later years amid shifting political climates. Others evaded capture entirely. For survivors, this reality was painful. Testimony did not guarantee closure, but it did establish record. As decades passed, survivors became educators. They visited schools. They stood before students who had no personal memory of war. They described the stages, the early arrests of political opponents, the normalization of discrimination, the escalation into mass imprisonment. They emphasized process. Buchenwald had not appeared overnight. It had been built step by step. First a forest cleared, then barracks erected, then categories defined, then labor exploited, then experiments conducted, then executions formalized. Survivor testimony illuminated that progression. In the 1960s and 70s, a new generation of Germans began confronting their country's past more directly. Students questioned parents. Archives were reopened. Trials such as those in Frankfurt, prosecuting Auschwitz personnel, renewed public discussion. Buchenwald was revisited through this broader reckoning. Exhibitions expanded. Historical research deepened. The role of bystanders, those in Weimar and surrounding areas, was examined more critically. Survivors often returned to the Ettersberg to participate in commemorations. Standing on the roll call square, they spoke not only of suffering but of responsibility. Memory, they insisted, was not optional. It was an obligation. As the 20th century drew towards close, survivor voices grew more urgent. Time was shortening. The men and women who had endured Buchenwald were aging. Recording their testimonies became a race against mortality. Oral history projects captured thousands of hours of interviews. Faces lined with age spoke of youth interrupted. Voices cracked when recounting moments long suppressed. The digital age amplified these testimonies. Videos became accessible worldwide. Students in countries far from Germany could hear directly from those who had stood beneath the inscription on the gate. The impact was profound. Holocaust education increasingly centered on personal narrative. Buchenwald's story, once confined to trial transcripts and historical monographs, became humanized. Through testimony, the camp's complexity emerged. It was not solely a Jewish experience, though Jewish suffering there was immense. It was not solely political repression, though that was foundational. It was a convergence of ideologies, policies, and human decisions. Survivors also grapple with moral questions. What did survival mean when so many perished? How does one live after witnessing such systematic cruelty? Some wrote of guilt, others of resilience. Many of the bonds formed in the camp, forged in shared hunger and shared risk, endured for decades. Reunions were held. Photographs were taken of elderly men standing together on the roll call square, pointing to where their barracks once stood. Their presence transformed the memorial into something more than static stone. It became a living archive. In international discourse, Buchenwald contributed to the development of the concept of genocide. The United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted in 1948, was influenced by the revelations of camps across Europe. While extermination centers in occupied Poland embodied the industrialized murder of the Holocaust most starkly, places like Buchenwald demonstrated how repression, exploitation, and killing operated in stages. Scholars studying Buchenwald analyzed bureaucratic language. They traced how terms like special treatment, massed execution. They examined contracts between the SS and private industry, revealing economic complicity. They studied the evolution from political imprisonment to multinational forced labor to medical experimentation. Each layer provided insight into how modern states could weaponize administrative systems. Survivors often emphasized this lesson. Evil did not appear as chaos. It appeared as order, as paperwork, as routines. That insight resonated far beyond Germany. In later decades, when other genocides occurred, in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in the Balkans, observers drew parallels. They asked whether earlier warning signs had been missed. They invoked the phrase, "never again." But survivors of Buchenwald understood that "never again" required vigilance. Memory had to be active. As the survivor generation dwindled, responsibility shifted. Educators, historians, curators, and descendants became carriers of testimony. Children and grandchildren of survivors visited Buchenwald to connect with stories they had heard at kitchen tables. They stood in the execution room, imagining their relatives' footsteps. They touched the brick of the crematorium walls. They inherited memory secondhand. In recent years, debates about Holocaust distortion and denial have intensified. Social media spreads misinformation quickly. Conspiracy theories circulate. In this environment, Buchenwald's preserved structures and recorded testimonies serve as anchors. The measuring board remains tangible proof. The photographs from April 1945 remain visible. The names on memorial plaques resist erasure. Survivor testimony, once fragile and personal, has become institutional memory. But institutional memory must be maintained. Annual commemorations continue. On significant anniversaries, Liberation Day, Kristallnacht, ceremonies are held. Speakers remind audiences that Buchenwald was not inevitable. It was constructed, it was staffed, it was normalized, and it was resisted. The story of the camp's internal resistance has also evolved through testimony. Former underground leaders detailed how they organized secretly, how they smuggled weapons, how they protected children in Block 66. These accounts complicate narratives of pure victimhood. They highlight agency within oppression. They demonstrate that even in environments designed to strip humanity, choices remained dangerous, limited, but real. Testimony also preserves ambiguity. Not every capo was a monster. Not every prisoner was a hero. Survivors speak honestly about moral gray zones, about theft driven by hunger, about moments of despair, about compromises made to survive. This honesty deepens understanding. Buchenwald is not remembered as a mythic battleground of pure evil versus pure good. It is remembered as a human environment shaped by ideology, fear, cruelty, solidarity, and survival. The courtroom scenes of the late 1940s were only the beginning. The real trial has been ongoing, in classrooms, in memorial halls, in public debates. Each generation stands metaphorically before the measuring board, asked to consider how systems of dehumanization begin. The gate remains. The wind still moves through it. Visitors pass beneath the inscription and into a space heavy with layered history. They read testimonies displayed on walls. They watch archival footage. They stand in silence. The voices of survivors echo through speakers in exhibition halls. They speak of hunger, of cold, of smoke, of fear, and of liberation. As long as those voices are heard, Buchenwald cannot be reduced to stone. It remains a warning, carried not only in architecture, but in language. The next chapter will turn toward the broader legacy, how Buchenwald shaped international law, human rights discourse, and global memory culture. Because testimony does not end with recounting. It demands response. And the world's response to Buchenwald continues to unfold. The photograph is black and white. It shows a row of skeletal men staring into the camera, their eyes hollow, their cheekbones sharp as blades. Behind them, the barracks sag under the weight of years and weather. An American soldier stands off to the side, helmet tilted back slightly, as if still trying to process what he is seeing. That image will travel. It will appear in newspapers across the United States and Europe. It will be pinned to bulletin boards. It will be clipped and saved. It will shock audiences who had heard rumors but had not yet seen proof. Buchenwald becomes not only a place on a hill above Weimar, but a symbol in global consciousness. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, American journalists file reports that describe what they witnessed in vivid detail. Words like starvation, atrocity, and mass murder appear in headlines. Photographs of emaciated prisoners circulate widely. For many outside Europe, Buchenwald is the first concentration camp they encounter by name. Its proximity to Weimar, to Goethe's Garden House, to the cultural heart of Germany, makes the contrast even more startling. How could a place of such calculated cruelty exist so near a city associated with poetry and philosophy? The question reverberates. Buchenwald becomes central to the emerging global understanding of Nazi crimes. At the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors reference camps like Buchenwald as evidence of systematic persecution and murder. Film footage from liberation is shown in courtrooms. The images silence the room. The legal category of crimes against humanity gains definition through places like this. No longer are atrocities framed solely as wartime excesses. They are recognized as coordinated policies targeting civilian populations. Buchenwald contributes to this shift. It was not a battlefield. It was an institution. Its crimes were bureaucratic, administrative, organized. That distinction matters. In the years that follow, international human rights law begins to crystallize. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, asserts protections that respond implicitly to the violations witnessed in camps. The right to life, the right to freedom from torture, the right to due process. These principles are shaped in part by the memory of sites like Buchenwald. But memory does not move in a straight line. As the Cold War deepens, Buchenwald's symbolism is pulled into competing narratives. In East Germany, the camp becomes a foundational myth of anti-fascist identity. The state emphasizes the heroism of communist prisoners, framing them as the moral core of resistance. The uprising in April 1945 is highlighted as a triumph of organized political will. International delegations from socialist countries visit regularly. Wreaths are laid. Speeches invoke solidarity. In West Germany, The confrontation with Nazi crimes evolves more unevenly. Economic reconstruction takes priority in the early post-war years. Public discussion of guilt and complicity is often muted. Yet Buchenwald's images linger. They surface in debates about rearmament, about former Nazis in government positions, about education reform. As younger generations challenge silence in the 1960s, Buchenwald re-enters national conversation. Student movements demand transparency. They question how many former camp officials reintegrated quietly into society. They insist that memory must not be confined to ceremonies. Meanwhile, beyond Germany, Buchenwald's name enters literature, film, and scholarship. Survivor memoirs circulate widely. Academic studies analyze the camp's administrative structure, its economic integration into the SS system, its role in forced labor networks. Historians trace how Buchenwald evolved from a camp for political opponents to a multinational industrial complex. The camp becomes a case study in the mechanics of repression. Museums around the world reference it in exhibitions about the Holocaust. Documentaries include footage of the gate, the crematorium, the roll call square. Each repetition reinforces recognition. Yet repetition carries risk. Over time, images can become familiar. Familiarity can dull shock. Educators grapple with this challenge. How to ensure that Buchenwald remains real, not abstract. How to convey that these were not symbols, but people. One answer lies in individual stories. Rather than presenting only numbers, 250,000 imprisoned, tens of thousands dead, memorial programs emphasize names. A French resistance fighter who smuggled messages. A Jewish tailor arrested after Kristallnacht. A Soviet POW shot in the execution room. A teenage boy hidden in Block 66. Personal narratives cut through abstraction. They anchor memory. As the 20th century closes, Buchenwald's legacy intersects with new global crises. When genocide unfolds in Rwanda in 1994, commentators invoke the phrase, "never again," and question why the world failed to intervene. When ethnic cleansing devastates the Balkans, journalists draw parallels to earlier atrocities in Europe. Buchenwald becomes part of a moral vocabulary. It stands as shorthand for the consequences of unchecked ideology. At the same time, Holocaust denial and distortion emerge more aggressively in certain circles. Pamphlets claim camps were exaggerated. Websites question photographs. In response, institutions preserve evidence meticulously. The measuring board in the execution room is not removed. The crematorium ovens are not demolished. Archival documents are digitized. Survivor testimonies are recorded in high-definition video. Facts are reinforced through scholarship. The battle over memory becomes active. Buchenwald is no longer only a historical site. It is part of a contemporary struggle over truth. Educational programs expand to address these challenges directly. Visitors are taught not only what happened, but how misinformation spreads. They learn to analyze sources. They confront propaganda techniques used by the Nazi regime. The lesson becomes dual. Remember the past and recognize its warning signs in the present. The memorial also engages with broader themes of authoritarianism. Exhibitions explore how legal frameworks were dismantled gradually in the 1930s, how emergency decrees normalized extraordinary powers, how language shifted to dehumanize minorities. These discussions connect Buchenwald to universal questions. It is not only about Germany in the 1940s. It is about the fragility of democratic norms. On international commemorations, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the anniversary of liberation, Buchenwald's role is reaffirmed. Leaders from various countries visit. They stand beneath the inscription. They speak of responsibility. Yet speeches alone cannot preserve memory. The physical site carries weight. Visitors who walk through the little camp area often pause longest there. The foundations of overcrowded barracks are marked. Explanatory panels describe typhus outbreaks, starvation, evacuation transports. The air feels heavy, even decades later. The forest has partially reclaimed the hill. Trees sway gently. Birdsong returns. The contrast remains unsettling. Nature appears indifferent to history, but human memory refuses indifference. Buchenwald's integration into global consciousness ensures that it is referenced whenever societies confront mass incarceration or state violence. Scholars studying modern detention centers draw cautious comparisons. Activists invoke the language of "never again" in debates over refugee treatment. These analogies are sometimes controversial. Historians caution against oversimplification. But the very fact that Buchenwald's name surfaces in such discussions underscores its symbolic power. It represents a threshold crossed, a moment when bureaucracy and ideology fused into sustained cruelty. For Germany, Buchenwald is part of a broader landscape of remembrance. Other camps, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, form a network of sites that collectively define the memory of the Nazi era. Each has distinct features. Buchenwald's distinctiveness lies in its evolution and its proximity to Weimar. It was not primarily a death factory in the same sense as extermination camps in occupied Poland. It was a concentration camp that transformed over time, absorbing political prisoners, Jews, POWs, resistance fighters, forced laborers, and evacuees from other camps. Its story reflects the arc of the Third Reich itself, from consolidation of power to total war to collapse. In recent years, efforts to engage younger audiences have intensified. Interactive exhibits allow visitors to trace individual prisoner biographies. Audio installations play excerpts from testimonies. Digital archives provide access to scanned documents. The goal is to move beyond static remembrance, to foster active engagement. As survivor numbers diminish, the responsibility shifts further to institutions and society at large. Teachers receive training on how to address Holocaust history sensitively and accurately. Students are encouraged to reflect on ethical choices. The measuring board remains on the wall. The crematorium remains intact. The roll call square remains vast. But the meaning of these spaces depends on those who enter them. Memory is not automatic. It requires cultivation. Buchenwald's legacy extends into international law, into education, into moral discourse. But it also resides in quiet moments. A visitor standing alone near the gate at dusk. Wind moving through iron letters. Silence where once there was shouting. In that silence, the weight of history presses gently but persistently. The world has changed since 1945, but the questions raised by Buchenwald remain urgent. How does a society define who belongs? How does language normalize exclusion? How does obedience become complicity? In the final chapter of this story, the focus will turn to reflection, to the enduring meaning of Buchenwald in a century shaped by violence and memory, and to the responsibility carried forward by those who walk through its gates today. Because history does not end with preservation. It continues in interpretation, and interpretation shapes the future. The wind moves through the gate again. It does not ask permission. It does not remember the men who once stood beneath it for hours, boots frozen to gravel, eyes fixed forward as numbers were called. It passes through the iron letters the same way it did in 1937, in 1945, in every year since. But we remember. Buchenwald no longer imprisons bodies. It holds something else now, the weight of what human systems are capable of building when fear, ideology, and bureaucracy align. If you stand alone on the roll call square today, you can hear almost nothing. No whistle, no dogs barking, no shouted commands, only wind, distant birds, perhaps the low murmur of visitors speaking quietly. The gravel crunches underfoot, just as it did decades ago. The space is unchanged in its dimensions, but its meaning has shifted completely. It began as a clearing in a forest. Men were forced to cut down trees with numb hands, turning nature into infrastructure. The first barracks rose in mud and cold. Political prisoners filled them, communists, social democrats, trade unionists. The regime told itself it was defending order. Then the categories expanded. Jewish men arrested after Kristallnacht arrived, their lives shattered overnight. Polish intellectuals and resistance fighters followed after invasion. Soviet prisoners of war were marched through the gates and led quietly to execution rooms disguised as examination chambers. The camp evolved as the Reich evolved, from repression to exploitation, from intimidation to industrial integration, from labor to experimentation, from starvation to systematic killing. It did not transform in a single moment. It shifted incrementally. Each shift justified in the language of necessity. Each shift normalized by routine. That is one of Buchenwald's most enduring lessons. It was not chaos. It was administration. Forms were filled. Lists were updated. Contracts were signed between SS officials and industrial companies. Measurements were taken before bullets were fired. Medical charts were updated as fevers raged. Cruelty was cataloged. And because it was cataloged, it appeared orderly. The men who walked beneath the inscription above the gate were not told they were entering a place of chaos. They were told they were entering a system. Jedem das saying, to each his own, a phrase twisted into accusation. As the war intensified, the camp expanded outward, subcamps feeding underground factories, prisoners reduced to units of labor. The little camp filled beyond capacity when the front lines collapsed. Typhus and starvation did what bullets did not. Bodies were consumed by a structure that had learned to extract every possible resource. Even human bodies became research material. Block 46 stands today as silent evidence of that transformation. The measuring board remains on the wall in the execution room. A simple device, neutral in appearance, lethal in function. The crematorium ovens are cold now, but their brick walls absorb memory. Smoke once drifted across this hill in steady columns. It is difficult to stand near them and not imagine the weight of what was reduced to ash. And yet, Buchenwald did not end in complete annihilation. The prisoners organized. They risked everything to hide weapons, to build networks, to protect children in Block 66. When evacuation threatened to erase the final witnesses, they acted. The uprising in April 1945 was not cinematic. It was desperate. It was calculated. It was born from years of quiet coordination. American tanks arrived to find prisoners in control. Liberation came not only from outside, but from within. That detail matters. It complicates the narrative. Buchenwald was a place of victimization, but also of agency. Survival was not passive. Memory, too, has not been passive. Survivors carried Buchenwald beyond the Ettersberg. They testified in courtrooms. They wrote books. They stood in classrooms decades later, voices shaking as they described the cold of winter roll calls and the silence of execution rooms. They ensure that the camp would not dissolve into abstraction. As they age and pass, responsibility transfers. Now, visitors walk through the gate. Students who have only read about the war stand on gravel that once held men in stripes. They listen to recorded testimonies. They see photographs taken at liberation, skeletal figures staring into the lens. They confront the uncomfortable proximity of culture and cruelty. Weimar remains a city of literature and music. Buchenwald remains on its hill. The contrast endures. And that contrast forces a question. How does a society reconcile beauty with brutality? The answer is not simple. But Buchenwald suggests that culture alone does not inoculate against cruelty. Education alone does not prevent dehumanization. Structures of law, accountability, and moral courage must remain active. Because Buchenwald did not emerge from a void. It emerged from rhetoric that framed neighbors as threats, from emergency powers that suspended due process, from bureaucracies that processed humans as categories. It emerged from compliance and from fear. The camp's legacy is therefore not only about the men who died there. It is about the conditions that allowed it to function for 8 years in plain sight. It is about the bystanders who heard gunshots carried by wind and did not ask questions. It is about industries that signed contracts and did not inquire about the labor source. It is about administrators who stamped documents without confronting their consequences. When we speak of Buchenwald today, We speak not only of past atrocity, but of present vigilance. The phrase, "never again," echoes at commemorations. But those words demand substance. They demand awareness of how systems evolve. They demand attention to language that reduces human beings to categories. They demand resistance when incremental injustice begins. Buchenwald's story unfolds across 15 chapters, but its lessons extend beyond narrative structure. It is a warning about escalation, about how repression can transform into exploitation, exploitation into experimentation, experimentation into execution. It is also a testament to resilience, to the men who shared bread in secret, to the doctors who falsified records to save a life, to the resistance members who hid weapons beneath floorboards, to the children shielded in Block 66, and to the survivors who chose to speak. If you stand at the edge of the roll call square at dusk, the light changes slowly. Shadows stretch across gravel. The gate stands still. You might imagine the thousands who once stood here, waiting for numbers to be called. You might imagine the silence before a public hanging. You might imagine the distant rumble of American artillery growing louder on that final day. And then you might hear only wind. Memory does not recreate suffering fully. It cannot restore the dead, but can insist on truth. Buchenwald today is not a place of imprisonment. It is a place of confrontation. Visitors do not come to be comforted. They come to understand. They come to bear witness, even if secondhand. They come to ensure that the measuring board remains a historical artifact, not a blueprint. The iron letters remain above the gate. They face inward still. Their original meaning has inverted. They accuse the system that forged them. To each his own. What was delivered to the prisoners of Buchenwald was not justice. It was ideology hardened into structure. But what we choose to deliver to memory is something else. We can choose honesty. We can choose vigilance. We can choose to recognize the early signs of dehumanization. The forest that once covered this hill has grown again in places. Trees sway gently. Nature reclaims space slowly. But the foundations of barracks remain visible. They outline absence. They mark where men slept, where they whispered, where they endured. Absence is part of memory. It reminds us of what was lost, and what must not be lost again. The story of Buchenwald begins with trees being cut down. It ends with visitors walking through a preserved gate. Between those moments lies a lesson carved into stone, brick, and testimony. The wind moves through the iron letters once more. It carries no ideology, only air. What we carry is different. We carry knowledge, and knowledge, if honored, can be protection. The gate stands. The hill endures. The story remains. And it is ours now to remember.